even through the warehouse's thick walls, rain hammering against the metal roof like artillery fire. Maybe the wind had knocked something over. Maybe the old building was settling again, creaking its arthritic joints in the weather. I opened the app. The live feed loaded slowly, pixels resolving into the familiar view of my studio apartment. The camera was mounted in the corner where the kitchenette met the living area, giving me a wide-angle view of most of the space. Everything seemed normal at first. My second-hand couch, the coffee table with its ring stains, the window with its view of the brick wall next door. Then I saw it. Someone was standing in the middle of my living room. My first thought was absurdly calm. That's not possible. I'd locked the door. I'd checked it twice, the way I always did, turning the handle to make sure the deadbolt had engaged. The windows were painted shut. Had been since I moved in 6 months ago. The landlord had apologized about it, promised to fix them, never did. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, facing the camera directly, as if it knew exactly where to look. The video quality was terrible, all compression artifacts and digital noise from the low light, but I could make out a human shape. Average height, maybe. Dark clothes, or maybe that was just the shadows. The face was a pale blur, features indistinguishable. I zoomed in, my fingers shaking slightly as I pinched the screen. The image pixelated further, becoming abstract blocks of light and dark. When I zoomed back out, the figure was still there, still staring. My supervisor was calling my name. I looked up, disoriented, to find him standing a few feet away with a clipboard. Had he been calling me for long? I couldn't remember. I mumbled something about needing to make a call, family emergency, and he waved me off with the exhausted indifference of someone who'd been working nights too long to care. I walked quickly to the break room, my phone clutched in my hand, the screen still showing that impossible image. The figure hadn't moved. I called my landlord first, straight to voicemail, then building security, except there was no building security, just a number that forwarded to the landlord's voicemail. I even tried my neighbor across the hall, the one who worked nights as a nurse, thinking maybe she'd heard something. No answer. The rain was getting worse. Through the break room window, I watched it cascade down in sheets, turning the parking lot into a shallow lake. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed seconds later by a roll of thunder that seemed to go on forever. I looked back at my phone. The figure was gone. My relief lasted exactly 3 seconds, the time it took for me to realize that I hadn't seen it leave. I rewound the footage, watching the timestamp tick backward. 3:51, 3:50, 3:49, 3:48, 3:47. There. The figure appeared at 3:47:13, but not the way a person enters a room. One frame the room was empty, the next frame it was there, as if someone had spliced 2 different videos together. I played it forward again, frame by frame this time, watching for the moment it disappeared. 4 minutes, 2 seconds, 45 frames. Same thing. There one frame, gone the next. My hands were properly shaking now. I scrolled through the other camera feeds. I had 3 in total. One in the living area, one covering the door, one in the bedroom. The door camera showed nothing, just the empty hallway beyond my apartment, dimly lit by the building's ancient fixtures. The bedroom camera showed my unmade bed, clothes on the floor, everything exactly as I'd left it. I switched back to the living room feed, now showing the empty room in real time. Or what I assumed was real time. The timestamp in the corner matched my phone's clock, but how could I really know? How could I trust anything these cameras showed me? The rest of my shift passed in a haze. I checked the app obsessively every few minutes, expecting to see the figure again. Nothing. Just my empty apartment, occasionally lit by flashes of lightning through the window. By the time 7 a.m. rolled around and my replacement arrived, I'd almost convinced myself it had been some kind of glitch, electronic interference from the storm maybe. These were $40 cameras from a sketchy online retailer. You get what you pay for. The drive home was treacherous. The storm had knocked out traffic lights, turning intersections into 4-way stops that nobody seemed to understand. Tree branches littered the streets. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, but the sky remained dark, pregnant with the promise of more violence to come. I parked in the building's basement garage and sat in my car for a full minute, engine off, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant sound of water dripping. The garage was poorly lit, half the fluorescents dead or dying, creating pools of shadow between the concrete pillars. Every car looked suspicious. Every shadow could hide someone. Get it together, I told myself. It was a glitch, a digital ghost, nothing more. The elevator ride to the fourth floor seemed to take forever. The old machinery groaned and rattled, making me acutely aware of the cables and pulleys that kept me suspended above 3 stories of empty space. When the doors finally opened, I practically leaped into the hallway. My apartment door was exactly as I'd left it, locked. No signs of forced entry, no scratches around the lock, nothing out of place. I turned the key and pushed the door open slowly, listening. Silence. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain against windows. I flicked on the lights and did a thorough search, checking behind the couch, in the closet, under the bed, anywhere someone could hide in a 500-square-foot studio. Nothing. Everything was exactly where it should be, down to the coffee mug I'd left on the counter and the mail I'd tossed on the table. But something felt wrong. Not different exactly, but wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Like when you return to a childhood home and all the furniture is the same, but the proportions feel off. The angles of the room seemed subtly incorrect, as if the walls had shifted a few degrees while I was gone. I pulled out my phone and opened the security app, checking the recorded footage from when I'd been searching the apartment just now. There I was, captured in grainy black and white, moving through the space, looking behind furniture, opening doors. The timestamp matched. Everything seemed normal. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In the footage, as I was checking under the bed, there was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where my image seemed to split, like a double exposure or a glitch in the matrix. 2 of me, occupying the same space, slightly out of sync. I rewound and played it again. There, 8:13:27, a brief doubling, so quick you'd miss it if you weren't looking. I walked to the spot where it had happened, stood exactly where I'd been standing in the video. The floorboard creaked under my weight, a sound I'd grown accustomed to over the months, but now it seemed louder, more prolonged, as if the wood was straining against something beneath it. The rain picked up again, drumming against the windows with renewed intensity. I realized I was exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee, my thoughts becoming increasingly paranoid and disconnected. I needed sleep. Everything would make more sense after I'd rested. I kicked off my shoes, collapsed onto the bed fully clothed, and closed my eyes. The notification woke me at 3:47 p.m. Motion detected. Living room. My mouth was dry, my head foggy with the disorientation of daytime sleep. For a moment, I couldn't remember why the notification filled me with such dread. Then it all came rushing back. I grabbed my phone, fingers fumbling with the lock screen. The security app opened to the living room feed. The figure was back. Same position, same pose, same direct stare at the camera. But this time something was different. This time I was home. This time, only a thin wall separated me from whatever was standing in my living room. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound from beyond the bedroom. Nothing. Not a footstep, not a breath, not even the subtle displacement of air that comes with another person's presence. Keeping my eyes on the screen, I slid out of bed as quietly as possible. My work boots were still by the door. I grabbed one, feeling ridiculous but needing something solid in my hand. The bedroom door was cracked open slightly. Through the gap I could see a sliver of the living room, empty. But on my phone screen, the figure remained. I pushed the door open wider, revealing more of the living room, completely empty. The couch, the coffee table, the window, everything exactly as it should be. But on the screen, that impossible figure stood in the center of it all. I stepped into the living room, phone in one hand, boot in the other. I was standing now exactly where the figure appeared to be standing in the feed. I could see myself on the screen, superimposed with the dark shape, occupying the same space. The image flickered, doubled, tripled, multiple versions of reality stacked on top of each other like acetate sheets. Then, for just a moment, I saw something that made my blood freeze. In the feed, the dark figure moved, just its head, turning slightly as if to look at something off camera. But I hadn't moved. I was standing perfectly still, barely breathing. The figure's head turned back to face the camera, and now I could make out more details. The face was still blurred, but there was something wrong with the proportions. The eyes were too far apart, or maybe there were too many of them. The mouth was a dark void that seemed to extend beyond where a mouth should end. I looked down at my own body, then back at the screen. The figure was mimicking my movements now, but with a slight delay, like a shadow that couldn't quite keep up. When I raised my hand, it raised its hand a second later. When I took a step back, it followed. The storm outside intensified, and with a crackling buzz, the lights flickered. In that brief moment of darkness, I could have sworn I saw something in the corner of my vision. A shape that shouldn't be there. A density in the darkness that suggested presence. The lights came back on. The room was empty. But the feeling remained, that sensation of being watched by something that existed just outside the range of normal perception. I checked the other cameras. The door camera showed the empty hallway, but there were gaps in the footage, moments where the image would freeze or skip, like someone had edited out frames. The bedroom camera was worse. It showed my bed, but sometimes there were indentations in the mattress that weren't there in reality, as if someone invisible was lying down. I called in sick for my next shift, and the next. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom, instead dozing fitfully on the couch where I could see most of the apartment. I kept all the lights on, burning through electricity I couldn't afford, creating an artificial day that never ended. The figure appeared every night at 3:47 a.m. Sometimes it stood in the living room. Sometimes it was in the bedroom, standing over the empty bed. Once, I saw it in the bathroom mirror, visible in the camera's feed, but not in reality. Or at least, not in the reality I could see with my naked eyes. I started recording everything, creating folders of footage on my laptop. Hours and hours of video, documenting the impossible. I found patterns. The figure appeared more clearly during storms. It moved more when I was tired. It seemed to respond to my emotional state, becoming more active when I was afraid, more solid when I was angry. But the worst part was what I found when I reviewed the older footage from before the first appearance. The figure had always been there, in recordings from weeks ago, months ago. I could see it now, faint, barely visible, like a watermark on reality. Standing in the corner while I watched TV, sitting on the edge of my bed while I slept, following me from room to room, always just outside my peripheral vision. How long had it been there? Since I moved in? Before that? Had it been in my previous apartment? My childhood home? How many years had I lived with this thing watching me and I'd never known? I tried moving the cameras, changing angles, using different apps. It didn't matter. The figure adapted, always knowing where to stand to be seen. Or perhaps it existed in the cameras themselves, in the digital space between reality and recording. My neighbor across the hall knocked on my door one evening, concerned. She said I looked terrible, that she could hear me talking to myself at all hours. I wanted to show her the footage, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But when I pulled up the videos on my phone, the figure wasn't there. The apartments in the recordings were empty, normal, free of any supernatural presence. Only I could see it. Only when I was alone. The storm returned last night, worse than before. The power went out completely this time, plunging the building into darkness. My cameras, running on battery backup, continued recording. In the green-tinted night vision mode, the figure was clearer than ever. It wasn't standing still anymore. It was moving through my apartment with purpose, touching things, examining objects. It picked up the photo of my parents from the bookshelf, studied it, set it back down at a different angle. It opened drawers, rifled through papers, read my mail, and then it did something that shattered what was left of my grip on reality. It sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The bedroom camera, positioned perfectly, captured it typing. I watched in horror as it accessed my files, my photos, my entire digital life. It opened the folder where I'd been saving all the security footage, and one by one began deleting the files. But here's the thing, my laptop was closed. In reality, sitting right next to me on the couch, it was closed and powered off. Yet in the camera feed, I could see the screen's glow illuminating that awful, distorted face as it methodically erased the evidence of its own existence. When the power came back on, the footage was gone. All of it. Weeks of recordings vanished as if they'd never existed. The only proof I had left was my own memory, and even that felt unreliable now. It's 3:44 a.m. as I write this. 3 minutes until the figure appears. I've turned off all the cameras, deleted the apps, thrown my phone in a drawer. I don't want to see it anymore. I don't want to know. But I can feel it. Even without the cameras, I can feel its presence. It's here, has always been here, will always be here. The cameras didn't reveal it. They just gave it a way to reveal itself to me. A digital mirror reflecting something that exists in the spaces between what we can see and what we know is there. The clock on my laptop reads 3:46 a.m., 1 minute. I close my eyes, but I can still see it behind my eyelids, that pale face with its impossible features, standing in the center of my living room, waiting, always waiting. 3:47 a.m. I don't need to look. I know it's there, standing exactly where it always stands, staring at the corner where the camera used to be. Or maybe it's staring at me. Maybe it always has been. The storm is passing. The rain has softened to a whisper against the windows. In a few hours, the sun will rise and I'll go about my day, pretending everything is normal. I'll go back to work eventually. I'll smile at my neighbors. I'll live my life, but I'll always know it's there. In every reflection, every shadow, every glitch in my vision when I'm too tired to focus. It's found a way in, not through doors or windows, but through the cracks in perception itself. And the worst part? The part that keeps me awake even when exhaustion claws at my consciousness? Sometimes when I catch a glimpse of myself in the bathroom mirror, or the dark window at night, I'm not entirely sure which one of us is real anymore. Maybe I'm the one who only exists in the cameras. Maybe I'm the glitch, the ghost in someone else's machine. Maybe I've been standing in someone else's living room all along, staring at them through their screens, waiting for them to notice me. The thought should terrify me. Instead, it feels like coming home. Story 2. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other, except it wasn't. I just pulled into my driveway at 7:31 a.m., exhausted from another 12-hour shift at the distribution center. My eyes burned from the fluorescent warehouse lights, and my shoulders ached from loading trucks all night. The small bungalow I rented on the outskirts of town looked especially inviting in the soft morning light. Weathered blue siding, peeling white trim, and that crooked mailbox I kept meaning to fix. I fumbled with my phone while walking to the door, intending to check the weather. Instead, my thumb found the smart doorbell app. I don't know why I opened it. Maybe some primitive instinct, the kind that makes you check locks twice or glance over your shoulder in empty parking lots. The notification badge showed 17 alerts from the past week. Strange, I rarely got visitors. What I saw next made my blood turn to ice water. Every single alert was time-stamped at 7:20 a.m. Not 7:19 or 7:21, but exactly 7:20. 7 days straight. I scrolled back further. 2 weeks. 3. The pattern held perfect and unbroken. Someone had been ringing my doorbell every morning, exactly 10 minutes before I arrived home. My hands trembled as I opened the first video. The figure filled the frame, impossibly tall, maybe 7 feet, wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt that obscured any facial features. They stood perfectly still, arm extended toward the doorbell, but what disturbed me most was their posture. They weren't looking at the door or checking their phone like a normal delivery person might. The hood was angled directly at the camera, as if they knew I'd be watching this recording later, as if they were performing for an audience of one. The figure held that position for exactly 30 seconds, then turned and walked out of frame with movements that seemed wrong. Too fluid, like watching someone walk underwater or in slow motion, though the timestamp showed normal playback speed. I checked another video, then another, each one identical, same figure, same 30-second performance, same unsettling exit. My mouth went dry. The morning sun suddenly felt cold on my skin. Inside, I deadbolted the door and drew every curtain. The familiar sanctuary of my rented bungalow now felt exposed, vulnerable. I paced the narrow hallway, mind racing. Who knew my schedule that precisely? I worked rotating shifts, but Tuesdays through Saturdays, I always clocked out at 7 a.m. sharp. 20-minute drive home. The math was simple, deliberate. I called in sick for the next shift, something I hadn't done in 2 years. My supervisor sounded concerned. I was reliable, never missed work. I mumbled something about food poisoning and hung up. That night, I sat in my darkened living room, watching the doorbell's live feed on my laptop. The street remained empty except for the occasional passing car, their headlights sweeping across my small front yard like searchlights. At 7:20 a.m., nothing happened. The doorbell stayed silent. The feed showed only my empty porch, the worn wooden boards I'd been meaning to restain, the ceramic pot with the dead succulent I'd forgotten to water. I felt almost disappointed, like a child whose monster failed to appear after finally working up the courage to look under the bed. But then I checked the recorded footage from that morning, and my disappointment transformed into something far worse. There it was, time-stamped 7:20 a.m., while I'd been sitting 5 feet from the door. The tall figure, the 30-second pose, the fluid exit. The doorbell had never chimed. My laptop, connected to the same system, had shown nothing. Yet the recording existed, impossible and undeniable. I downloaded the video and played it frame by frame. In the final moments, just before the figure disappeared from view, I noticed something I'd missed before. Their shadow. Despite walking away from my house, their shadow stretched toward my door, long and dark, as if the sun was setting behind them rather than rising in the east where it should have been. Sleep became impossible. I started arriving home at different times. 7:15, 7:25, 7:18. But the recordings never changed. Always 7:20 a.m., always the same figure, always that impossible shadow. I installed additional cameras, covering every angle of my property. They showed nothing while the doorbell faithfully documented its daily visitor. I tried staying home, calling in sick for a week straight. Every morning at 7:20, I stood behind my door, hand on the deadbolt, ready to confront whoever, whatever, was doing this. The doorbell never rang. The porch remained empty, but the recording appeared anyway, showing the figure standing exactly where I was looking through the peephole at nothing but morning air. On the 8th day of my self-imposed siege, something changed. The figure in the recording was closer to the door, their hood tilted at a different angle. Still 30 seconds, still that unnatural exit, but now I could make out the faintest suggestion of features within the hood's shadow, or rather, the absence of features, like looking at a face through heavy static. I decided to catch them in the act. I parked my car 2 blocks away and crept back to hide in the thick bushes beside my porch. 7:19 came and went. At 7:20 I heard footsteps on the wooden boards, heavy, measured, real. My heart hammered as I peered through the leaves. The porch was empty. The footsteps continued, creaking across boards I could see were bearing no weight. Then came the electronic chime of the doorbell, though I could clearly see no finger pressing it. I burst from the bushes, stumbling onto the porch. The footsteps stopped immediately. The morning air felt thick, oppressive, like breathing through wet cotton. There was a smell too, ozone and something organic like soil after rain. I stood there panting, probably looking insane to any neighbor who might have been watching. Mrs. Chen across the street was retrieving her newspaper. She waved hesitantly, and I forced myself to wave back, trying to appear normal while my world tilted off its axis. Inside, I immediately checked the recording. There I was, wild-eyed and disheveled, bursting from the bushes onto an occupied porch. The tall figure stood exactly where I'd been standing, And for one horrifying moment, our bodies occupied the same space in the frame. Then I moved, and they remained, completing their 30-second ritual as I fumbled with my keys in the background, oblivious to their presence. I started researching the house's history. The property management company was unhelpful, just another rental in their portfolio. City records showed nothing unusual. Previous tenants had stayed the typical 6 months to a year. Nobody had died here, at least not officially. But I found a detail that made my skin crawl. The house had been built in 1947, and the original owner had installed a doorbell in 1952. Every subsequent owner had kept that same doorbell location, updating the hardware but never moving the position. 7 decades of finger pressing that exact spot. The videos began changing more dramatically. The figure grew closer each day until their face, or the void where a face should be, nearly touched the camera. I could see into the hood now, into a darkness that seemed to extend beyond the fabric's physical boundaries, like looking into a tunnel that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I thought I glimpsed movement in that darkness, shapes that might have been features, or might have been something else entirely. I stopped going to work altogether. I couldn't explain why I needed time off. Couldn't articulate the dread that had taken root in my chest. My supervisor left increasingly concerned voicemails that I deleted without listening to completion. Money would become a problem soon, but that seemed like a concern for someone living in a rational world, and I no longer qualified. On the 14th day of my vigil, I decided to be waiting on the porch at 7:20. I sat in the old wooden chair I'd bought at a garage sale, facing the street, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to go inside, to run, to never come back. 7:19 arrived with my heart thundering. I gripped the chair's arms until my knuckles went white. At 7:20, I heard the footsteps behind me, on my own porch. Impossible, since I could see the entire front yard, and nobody had approached. The footsteps came closer, boards creaking under invisible weight. I couldn't turn around. My body simply refused, muscles locked in primordial terror. The smell intensified, earth and electricity and something else, something organic and wrong. I felt breath on my neck, cold and damp, a whisper, so faint I might have imagined it. "You're always 10 minutes late." The doorbell rang. I jerked forward, spinning around. The porch was empty. But the recording showed me in the chair, and the tall figure standing directly behind me, one grotesquely elongated hand resting on my shoulder. In the video, I didn't react to their touch. I just sat there, staring straight ahead, while they leaned down toward my ear. That night, I packed everything I could fit in my car. I didn't care about the lease, the security deposit, the job I'd abandoned. Some thresholds once crossed can't be uncrossed. As I loaded the last box, Mrs. Chen called out from her garden. "Moving out already? You've only been here, 4 months?" 6 months, I corrected automatically, then froze. How did I know that? I'd moved in. When had I moved in? The date felt slippery in my mind, like trying to hold water. She gave me a strange look. "No, dear. You moved in last month. I remember because it was right after the Johnsons left. They only stayed 6 weeks, poor things." Said something about the doorbell acting up. I drove away without responding, watching the bungalow shrink in my rearview mirror. It was 7:10 a.m. In 10 minutes, someone would ring that doorbell. Or maybe they already had. Maybe they were always ringing it, in some layer of reality I could only glimpse through digital recordings. I found a new place 3 towns over, a studio apartment in a complex with no doorbells, only buzzers. I thought I'd escaped. I thought geography and technology could save me. But last night, I discovered something that made me realize there is no escape, only deeper levels of the maze. I was reviewing old photos on my phone, trying to remember what normal felt like. I found a selfie I'd taken the day I moved into the bungalow, standing on that creaky porch, smiling and unaware. But in the background, barely visible through the window's reflection, was a tall figure in a hood standing in what would become my living room. I zoomed in with shaking fingers. The timestamp read 7:20 a.m. The photo was taken at 3 p.m., Now I understand. It was never about the doorbell, never about the house. The 10-minute gap wasn't when they arrived. It was when I was supposed to be there. Every morning at 7:20 a.m. somewhere, in some version of that moment, I'm walking up those porch steps, and they're waiting. They're always waiting. I check my new apartment's buzzer system obsessively now. No recordings yet, but I know it's only a matter of time. Time isn't what I thought it was. Neither am I. Sometimes I catch myself walking toward doors I don't remember approaching, reaching for doorbells that shouldn't exist. My reflection arrives places seconds before I do. This morning I woke up at 7:19 a.m. without setting an alarm. My hand was already reaching for the door handle. Outside my apartment, I heard footsteps that matched mine perfectly, like an echo that comes before the sound. I didn't open the door, but I know that somewhere, in some recording I haven't found yet, I already have. The doorbell here doesn't ring. It doesn't need to. They know I'm home. Story 3. The floorboards above my bedroom ceiling groaned with a familiar weight at exactly 3 in the morning. I knew because I'd been awake for the past hour, staring at the digital clock's red numerals as they crawled toward that dreaded time. It had been happening for 2 weeks now, ever since I'd moved into this decrepit Victorian rental on the outskirts of town. The house had been a steal, suspiciously cheap for its size, with original hardwood floors and ornate crown molding that belonged in a museum. The landlord, an elderly woman with trembling hands and eyes that never quite met mine, had mumbled something about the previous tenants leaving suddenly. I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered why a place this spacious sat empty for months in a tight rental market. But I was desperate. The divorce had cleaned me out, and this was all I could afford that didn't require a lengthy commute to work. So I signed the lease with barely a second thought, ignoring the musty smell that seemed to seep from the walls themselves, and the way shadows gathered too thickly in the corners. The attic access was in the hallway outside my bedroom, a narrow pull-down ladder that shrieked like rusty hinges when I first discovered it. The space above was cramped, barely 5 feet at its highest point, forcing anyone who entered to crawl or crouch. I'd gone up there exactly once when I first moved in, just to check for leaks or pest problems. The air had been thick with decades of dust, and something about the oppressive darkness made my skin crawl. I'd descended quickly, deciding there was nothing up there worth my attention. That was before the footsteps started. At first, I convinced myself it was the old house settling. Wood expands and contracts, pipes knock and rattle. These were the lies I told myself as I lay rigid in bed, listening to the deliberate rhythm of someone, something, pacing directly above me. The pattern never varied. 7 steps in one direction, a pause, then 7 steps back. Always at 3 in the morning, always lasting exactly 13 minutes. By the third night, I'd started sleeping on the couch downstairs. But even from the living room, I could hear it, that measured tread that seemed to follow some incomprehensible routine. During the day, I'd stand in the hallway, staring up at the attic door, trying to summon the courage to investigate. But something always held me back. Some primal instinct that whispered warnings in the primitive parts of my brain. It wasn't until I found the footprints that denial became impossible. I'd finally steeled myself to go up there on a Saturday afternoon, when sunlight streamed through the hall window and made everything seem less threatening. The ladder protested under my weight, and dust motes danced in the shaft of light that followed me up. The attic was exactly as I'd left it, or so I thought at first. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw them. Clear impressions in the thick dust coating the floor. The footprints were bare, human-sized, and they traced the exact pattern I'd been hearing. 7 steps one way, a pivot, 7 steps back. But what made my blood turn to ice water was that they were fresh. The crisp edges hadn't been softened by time or air currents. Someone had been up here recently. Someone had been up here while I slept below. My hands shook as I traced the path with my flashlight. The footprints led to and from the corner where the roof sloped lowest, a space so cramped that even crouching would be uncomfortable. I approached it slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. There, in the darkest recess, I found something that made me scramble backward so fast I nearly fell through the access hole. Scratched into the wooden beam, in jagged letters that looked carved by fingernails, were words, "You hear me now." I fled the attic and spent that night in a motel, trying to convince myself to break the lease, to run and never look back. But something drew me back. Maybe pride, maybe stupidity, or maybe something else entirely. Something that whispered that running wouldn't solve anything, that whatever was in that attic would simply follow. The next evening I set up a digital recorder in the attic. If someone was breaking into my home, I'd have evidence. If it was something else, well, I'd deal with that when I had proof. I placed it in the center of the room, activated the motion sensor, and retreated to my bedroom to wait. 3 in the morning came with its usual precision. The footsteps began their measured dance above me, and I lay there, knowing the recorder was capturing everything. The 13 minutes stretched like hours, each footfall seeming to press down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. When silence finally returned, I had to fight every instinct not to immediately retrieve the device. I waited until dawn, when weak sunlight filtered through my bedroom curtains. My hands trembled as I climbed the ladder and grabbed the recorder. Back in the safety of my bedroom, I connected it to my laptop and opened the audio file. At first, there was nothing but the ambient hum of an empty space. Then at exactly 3 a.m., according to the timestamp, the sounds began. But they weren't footsteps, not exactly. It was a dragging noise, like someone pulling themselves across the floor with their hands. The sound grew closer to the recorder, and I could hear breathing. Labored, wet, wrong somehow. Then came my voice. But I hadn't been in the attic. I'd been in my bed, paralyzed with fear, listening to the footsteps above. Yet there was my voice on the recording, whisper soft but unmistakably mine, reciting something in a monotone that made my skin crawl. 7 steps to remember, 7 steps to forget, 7 above and 7 below. The watcher watches the watched watching back. The words repeated 3 times, growing fainter each time, as if moving away from the recorder. Then silence. I played it again, certain I was misunderstanding, but there was no doubt. It was my voice, my exact intonation, even the slight rasp I get when I whisper. I should have left then, packed everything and fled without looking back. Instead, I found myself drawn into an obsessive investigation. I researched the house's history at the library, combing through property records and old newspapers. The house had been built in 1892 by a reclusive doctor who'd lost his medical license for unspecified, irregular practices. He'd lived alone until his death in 1924, found in the attic, having apparently been dead for weeks before anyone noticed. The records after that were spotty, but I found a pattern. Tenants never stayed long. The house would be occupied for a few months, maybe a year, then stand empty again. The reasons varied: job relocations, family emergencies, sudden illnesses. But the frequency was unsettling. I installed cameras next, small wireless ones that could capture the attic in night vision. I watched the feeds obsessively, but they showed nothing during those 13 minutes at 3 in the morning. The footsteps continued. The recorder captured more instances of my voice saying things I'd never said, but the cameras remained frustratingly empty. It was as if whatever was happening existed in some space adjacent to reality, bleeding through in sound but not in sight. My sleep deteriorated. I started seeing movement in my peripheral vision during the day, shadows that shouldn't be there, figures that vanished when I turned to look. My reflection in mirrors seemed delayed by a fraction of a second, as if it had to remember to copy my movements. Food tasted wrong, like everything was slightly synthetic. The world felt thin, like tissue paper that might tear if I pressed too hard against it. The breaking point came 3 weeks after I'd first heard the footsteps. I woke at 2:45 a.m. with an overwhelming compulsion to go to the attic. It wasn't fear or curiosity. It was need, like the urge to breathe after being underwater too long. I tried to resist, gripping my sheets, telling myself to stay in bed. But my body moved without my permission, feet finding the floor, legs carrying me to the hallway. The ladder was already down. though I knew I'd pushed it up before bed. I climbed without wanting to, my movements mechanical and precise. The attic was different in the darkness. Larger somehow, the angles wrong, the ceiling higher than it should be. And I wasn't alone. I couldn't see it directly, but I knew something was there, occupying the same space I was, existing in the gaps between heartbeats. The air was thick, almost solid, and breathing felt like drowning in reverse. My feet began to move in the familiar pattern. 7 steps forward, turn, 7 steps back. But I wasn't controlling them. I was a passenger in my own body, watching through eyes that no longer felt entirely mine. As I paced, I heard my voice speaking, but my mouth wasn't moving. Or maybe it was, and I couldn't feel it anymore. The words spilled out in a continuous stream, overlapping and echoing. The watcher becomes the watched. The keeper becomes the kept. 7 steps up and 7 steps down. The attic holds what the basement grounds. You were always here. You will always be here. This is the between place, where the sleeper wakes and the waker sleeps. The words meant nothing and everything. They felt ancient, like they'd been spoken in this space long before the house was built, before the land was claimed, before humans walked upright. They were a truth I didn't want to understand, a reality I couldn't accept. I don't remember descending the ladder or returning to bed. I woke, if I ever truly slept, at 7 a.m. with dirt under my fingernails and scratches on my arms that spelled out words in a language I couldn't read. The recorder in the attic had captured 6 hours of continuous whispering, all in my voice, telling stories about lives I'd never lived and deaths I'd never died. I still live in the house. I want to leave, but every time I try, I find myself back in the bedroom, as if I'd never left. The footsteps continue at 3 in the morning, and sometimes I'm not sure if I'm hearing them or making them. The attic door stays open now. It won't close no matter how many times I push it up. Sometimes during the day, I catch glimpses of someone in my peripheral vision, mimicking my movements with a slight delay. When I look in mirrors, there's a moment, just a fraction of a second, where my reflection continues what it was doing before it remembers to copy me. And sometimes, in that brief instant, I swear it's standing in an attic, pacing 7 steps forward and 7 steps back, its mouth moving in words I can't quite hear. The recorder still runs every night, and every morning I listen to my voice saying things I don't remember thinking. Last night it said something new. The original tenant never left. He just learned to share space. You're learning too. 7 steps to remember who you were. 7 steps to forget who you're becoming. Soon you won't know the difference. Soon you won't need to. I've stopped checking the recordings. I've stopped counting the days. Time feels elastic here, stretching and compressing without pattern. Sometimes I think I've been here for months. Sometimes it feels like years. The woman who rented me the house doesn't answer my calls anymore. Or maybe I'm not actually calling. It's hard to tell what's real when reality itself seems negotiable. The footsteps have changed. They're louder now, more confident, as if whatever makes them no longer cares about being heard. Or maybe I'm just hearing them better. Maybe I'm finally listening with the right ears. I write this during the daylight hours, when I can still remember that I'm supposed to be afraid. But even now, as the sun sets and shadows lengthen, I feel the pull of the attic. Tonight, I know I'll climb those stairs again. I'll pace those 7 steps, and maybe, finally, I'll understand why the pattern matters. Why it's always been 7. Why it has to be at 3 in the morning. Or maybe I already understand, and I'm just pretending I don't. Maybe I've always understood. Maybe that's why I'm really here. The footsteps above have started early tonight. It's only 2:47, but they're insistent, almost urgent. And for the first time, they're not following the pattern. They're coming down the ladder. They're in the hallway. They're at my door. But I'm not afraid anymore, because I just looked at my feet, and they're covered in dust, and I can't remember the last time I left this attic. Story 4. Fluorescent lights in the break room hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache. 3:47 a.m., The night shift at the bottling plant stretched ahead of me like a dark tunnel with no visible end, just the endless conveyor belt and the mechanical clatter that had become the soundtrack to my insomnia. I pulled out my phone, more out of habit than expectation. The screen glowed pale blue in the dimness, casting shadows across my hands that looked wrong somehow, fingers too long, joints at odd angles. I blinked and they looked normal again. 15 hours awake will do that to you. The notification appeared without sound. No preview, no name, just a message icon that seemed to pulse with an urgency I could feel in my chest. I tapped it, and the words materialized in stark white letters against black. "Don't go home tonight. He's waiting." My thumb hovered over the screen, but before I could process what I'd read, the message dissolved. Not deleted, dissolved. The letters fragmenting like ash in wind, leaving nothing but my reflection staring back from the darkened glass. I checked my message history. Nothing. No unknown numbers, no deleted conversations, no trace that anything had ever been there at all. The break room suddenly felt colder, and I became acutely aware of the silence that had settled over the factory floor. Even the machinery seemed to have paused, holding its breath. The rest of the shift passed in a fog of repetitive motion and mounting unease. Every time I glanced at my phone, I expected to see the message again, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. By the time 6 a.m. rolled around and the day shift began filtering in with their coffee and small talk, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. The bus ride home took 40 minutes through streets just beginning to wake. I watched the city scroll past the grimy windows, ordinary and solid, and felt the knot in my chest start to loosen. Exhaustion settled over me like a heavy blanket, and by the time I climbed the 3 flights to my apartment, the message had receded to something dreamlike and unreal. The door was locked. Of course it was locked. I turned the key and pushed inside, and that's when I felt it. A subtle wrongness that prickled across my skin like static electricity. The chair. The wooden chair I kept by the window. The one I always positioned at a precise angle so I could watch the street while drinking my morning coffee, had been moved. Not dramatically, just turned a few degrees to the left, facing the door instead of the window. I stood in the doorway, my bag still slung over one shoulder, staring at that chair. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of traffic. I walked slowly into the kitchen, my footsteps too loud on the linoleum, and opened the cabinet to put away the lunch container I'd brought back from work. The cabinet door was already open, just slightly, a crack of darkness between the door and the frame, but I always closed them. Always. Some habits become rituals when you live alone, small acts of order imposed on the chaos of solitary existence. And then I smelled it. Cigarette smoke. Not fresh, but lingering, woven into the fabric of the air like an invisible stain. I hadn't smoked in 6 years, not since my father's funeral, not since I'd scattered his ashes and sworn off everything that reminded me of him. I checked every room, looked behind the shower curtain, opened the closet where my few clothes hung in neat rows. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no missing valuables, no rational explanation for the chair or the cabinet or the smell that seemed to grow stronger the more I tried to identify it. I called the landlord. He suggested I'd moved the chair myself and forgotten, that maybe a neighbor smoked and the scent was drifting through the vents. He said it kindly, with the patient tone people use when they think you're wasting their time. I didn't mention the message. Something told me that would push the conversation from mildly concerned into actively worried about my mental state. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed watching the ceiling fan rotate, counting the revolutions, trying to sync my breathing to its rhythm. But every sound became amplified in the quiet. The building settling, pipes groaning, footsteps in the apartment above that seemed to pace back and forth, always stopping right above where I lay. The next night at work, I was jumpy, making mistakes. I dropped a clipboard, knocked over a stack of forms, startled badly enough when a coworker touched my shoulder that he actually backed away and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, just tired, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. I avoided checking my phone during break, Some superstitious part of me had decided that looking at it had summoned the message, and if I just didn't look, everything would return to normal. But when I got home at 6:30 a.m., the wrongness was worse. The chair had moved again. This time it was in the center of the room, facing my bed, positioned as if someone had been sitting there, watching the empty sheets where I should have been sleeping. The cabinet in the kitchen was wide open, all the doors, every single one, gaping like mouths frozen in silent screams. And on the small table by the window, my coffee cup sat steaming. Fresh coffee, still hot. I hadn't made coffee. I'd come straight home, hadn't even taken off my jacket. The cup sat there, mocking me with its impossible warmth, and I backed toward the door, my hand fumbling for the knob behind me. I spent that day at a diner 4 blocks away, drinking bitter coffee and watching the door, waiting for someone to walk in who looked wrong, who felt wrong. But everyone was just tired workers and early risers going about their ordinary lives. The waitress eventually asked if I needed anything else, and the concern in her voice made me realize I'd been sitting there for 6 hours. That night, I told my supervisor I was sick. He didn't believe me, I could tell, but he let me go home early. I walked the long way, taking side streets I didn't know, stopping frequently to look behind me. The city at 3 a.m. is a different creature than at dawn, darker, emptier, full of shadows that move when you're not quite looking at them. I stood outside my building for 20 minutes before I found the courage to go inside. The stairwell smelled like old cooking grease and something else, something acrid that I couldn't place. Each step creaked under my weight, announcing my presence to anyone who might be listening. My door was locked, but when I opened it, the smell hit me immediately. Not just cigarette smoke this time, but something personal, intimate. My father's cologne, the cheap drugstore brand he'd worn every day of his life. The smell that had clung to his clothes even after we donated them all. The chair was by the window again, but this time there was something on it. A photograph. I knew it without having to look, knew it with a certainty that made my hands shake as I crossed the room. It was a picture of me and my father, taken the summer before he died, standing in front of his old truck. I'd thrown away every photo I had of him. I'd been thorough, almost obsessive about it, needing to erase every reminder of the man who'd spent 20 years telling me I'd never amount to anything. But here it was, creased and faded, as if it had been carried in a wallet for years. I grabbed my phone with trembling fingers and called the police. They arrived 40 minutes later, 2 officers who looked tired and vaguely annoyed. They checked the locks, examined the windows, walked through the apartment with their flashlights, finding nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of an intruder. One of them suggested I install a security camera. The other recommended I call a friend, stay somewhere else for a few nights. Neither of them asked about the photograph. I'd put it in my pocket before they arrived, some instinct telling me that showing them would make everything worse. I started documenting everything. I wrote down the times things moved, took photos of the apartment before I left, and when I returned, trying to build a case that would convince someone, anyone, that I wasn't losing my mind. But the more I documented, the more the evidence seemed to work against me. How could I prove that I hadn't moved the chair myself? How could I demonstrate that the cabinet doors opened on their own? The photographs showed subtle changes, things that could easily be attributed to faulty memory or stress-induced confusion. The messages started appearing regularly after that. Never at the same time, never with any pattern I could predict. They came during my breaks, while I was walking home, once while I was in the shower, and found my phone lying on the bathroom counter when I knew I'd left it in the bedroom. Always the same words, always dissolving before I could screenshot them. He's waiting. Don't come home. He's been here all along. I stopped sleeping. Not consciously, but sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt watched, that crawling sensation of unseen eyes tracking my every movement. The apartment developed sounds it had never had before, creaking where no one walked, whispers that might have been pipes but sounded too much like breathing, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from inside the walls. I tried to leave. Packed a bag, made it as far as the door, but couldn't force myself to turn the knob. Because leaving meant admitting it was real, meant acknowledging that something was happening that defied explanation. And if it was real, if there truly was someone, something in my apartment, then where could I possibly go that it wouldn't follow? The worst part came 3 weeks after the first message. I got home from work to find the chair positioned exactly where I would sit it. The cabinet doors were closed. The apartment smelled only of stale air and the faint mustiness that comes from too many sleepless nights. Everything was exactly as I would have left it. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt a terror so profound it made my vision blur, because if everything was normal, if nothing had moved, it meant one of two things. Either whatever had been doing this was done with me, satisfied with whatever point it had proven, or I had been doing it all along. Moving the chair while in some fugue state, opening the cabinets in my sleep, placing that photograph I must have kept hidden somewhere even from myself. I stood in the center of the room and spun slowly, taking in every detail. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting everything in ordinary golden light. Just an apartment, just furniture and walls and the accumulated detritus of a solitary life. That's when I saw it. Written in the dust on my bedroom mirror, letters formed by the simple act of wiping clean sections of the grime. Look behind you. I didn't turn around. Couldn't, because I'd cleaned that mirror yesterday, scrubbed it until it shone, and the dust that should have taken weeks to accumulate had appeared overnight, thick enough to write in, thick enough to carry a message. And standing there, frozen, unable to turn and see what might be behind me, unable to look away from those 4 words, I finally understood. The waiting wasn't for me to come home. The waiting was for me to realize that I'd never been alone. Not since the message. Not since before that. Possibly not since my father died and left me with nothing but the echoing silence of an empty apartment and the crushing weight of words I could never take back. The sun continued to stream through the window. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the building, someone turned on a television, and canned laughter filtered through the walls. All so normal, all so perfectly ordinary. I forced myself to turn around. The apartment was empty. Of course it was empty. But the chair had moved again, and in the kitchen, I could hear the soft click of cabinet doors, opening one by one, in a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. I checked my phone with shaking hands. 3:47 a.m. But that was impossible. I could see daylight through the window, feel the warmth of morning sun on my face. My phone insisted otherwise, and with growing horror, I realized I couldn't remember the bus ride home, couldn't remember the walk up the stairs, couldn't remember anything after the break room at the factory where I'd sat under those buzzing fluorescent lights, staring at a message that may or may not have existed. The messages keep coming now. Sometimes I respond. Sometimes I beg whoever, whatever, is sending them to just show itself, to stop hiding, to end this. But they never answer, just keep arriving with their warnings and their implications. I still go to work, still ride the bus, still climb the 3 flights to my apartment. The chair moves, the cabinets open. The smell of cigarette smoke and cheap cologne ebbs and flows like a tide governed by rules I cannot comprehend. And sometimes, late at night when the factory machinery goes silent and the break room empties and I'm alone with my phone and the buzzing lights, I wonder if the message was ever meant as a warning at all. Maybe it was an invitation. Maybe he's not waiting for me to come home. Maybe he's waiting for me to realize I never left. The phone is buzzing in my hand right now. 3:47 a.m. The message appears, letters sharp and white against the darkness. Why do you keep trying to leave? And for the first time, I don't know if the question is being asked by someone else, or if I'm asking it of myself. The fluorescent lights hum overhead. The chair in my apartment is turning, and I cannot remember which room I'm sitting in anymore. The break room or my bedroom, the factory or home, the present or some moment I've been locked in since the night I first saw those words appear on my screen. He's waiting. He's always been waiting. And I'm starting to suspect that he and I might be the same person after all. Story 5. The notification came at 2:47 a.m. I'd been lying awake for an hour already, listening to the old boarding house settle around me. The radiator clanked. Floorboards contracted in the cooling night air. Somewhere down the hall, a door frame creaked with the shifting of century-old wood. Normal sounds. The sounds I'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 months since moving into room 7. My phone buzzed against the nightstand, its screen casting a pale blue glow across the water-stained ceiling. The notification was from the Ring camera I'd mounted outside my door 2 weeks ago, after the incident started. Motion detected. Someone was in the hallway. I unlocked the phone with trembling fingers and tapped the live feed. At first I saw nothing but the empty corridor stretching away from my door, illuminated by the camera's night vision in shades of silver and black. The floral wallpaper, peeling at the seams, looked diseased in the infrared light. The runner carpet, worn down to its backing in the center, led toward the stairwell at the far end. Everything appeared still. Then I saw him. He stood near the stairs, perhaps 15 feet from my door. A man in what looked like dark clothing, though the night vision made it difficult to determine colors or fine details. He wasn't moving, just standing there in the middle of the hallway, facing my direction, facing my camera, facing me. My mouth went dry. I sat up slowly, the springs in the old mattress groaning beneath me. The man in the feed didn't react to the sound. He remained perfectly motionless, his posture suggesting someone deep in thought, or someone listening. I watched him for 3 minutes, then 4. He never moved, never shifted his weight, never turned his head. The timestamp in the corner of the screen continued its relentless march forward, but the figure in the hallway existed outside of time, frozen in some private moment of consideration. My hand moved to the doorknob before I consciously decided to get up, but something stopped me. Some primal instinct whispered that opening the door would be a mistake, that whatever stood in the hallway wasn't waiting to be greeted. Instead, I began recording. The app allowed me to save the live feed directly to my phone. I hit the button and watched the red dot appear in the corner of the screen, confirming the recording had started. The man took a step forward. It wasn't a normal step. There was no transition between standing and moving. One moment he was 15 feet away, and the next he was 12 feet away, his right foot forward as if he'd simply materialized in a new position. The camera had a high frame rate. It shouldn't have missed the movement. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pressed myself against the headboard, phone clutched in both hands, eyes locked on the screen. Another step, then another. Each time, the same unnatural progression. No fluid motion, just discrete positions, like someone advancing through a series of still photographs. 9 feet away, 6 feet away. He was tall. That detail crystallized as he drew closer, well over 6 feet, with a thin frame that seemed to elongate in the camera's distorting lens. His face remained indistinct, a blur of shadows and pale skin, but I could see his eyes now. Or rather, I could see the dark hollows where his eyes should be. Twin voids that seemed to absorb the camera's infrared light. 3 feet from my door, 3 feet from me, with only a thin barrier of old wood between us. I stopped breathing. The recording continued, the timestamp advancing second by second. The figure stood directly in front of the camera now, close enough that his chest filled most of the frame. Close enough that I could see the rise and fall of his breathing, slow and steady and patient. Then his head tilted, not up or down, but sideways, like a dog hearing a distant sound. The movement was too fluid, too boneless. His neck bent at an angle that made my own neck ache in sympathy. He was looking at the camera, looking at me, looking at him. My thumb hit the stop button on the recording without conscious thought. I closed the app, locked my phone, shoved it under the pillow as if that might somehow sever the connection. For a long moment, I sat in the darkness, listening to my own ragged breathing and the renewed clanking of the radiator. Then I heard it. A soft sound from the hallway. Not footsteps, not the creak of floorboards. Something else. Something like breathing, slow and steady, coming from just beyond my door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the headboard, knees drawn up to my chest, watching the strip of dim light beneath my door for any sign of shadow movement. The breathing sound eventually stopped, or perhaps I simply grew too exhausted to distinguish it from the house's other noises. When pale dawn light finally crept through the window, I approached the door with the caution of someone defusing a bomb. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Nothing. Just the distant sound of another tenant's alarm clock and the rattle of pipes as someone started a shower on the floor below. I opened the door. The hallway was empty. Morning light slanted through the window at the far end, illuminating dancing dust motes and the faded floral wallpaper. Everything looked mundane, ordinary. The worn carpet showed no footprints, no disturbance. The air smelled of old wood and the coffee someone was brewing downstairs. I stepped out and approached the landing, examining the floor. No signs anyone had been there. No indication that anything unusual had occurred. For a moment, I wondered if I'd dreamed the entire thing. But my phone was still under my pillow, and the notification was still in my history. Motion detected, 2:47 a.m. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the Ring app. The recorded video from last night sat in my library, time-stamped and waiting. I hesitated before tapping it, some part of me already knowing what I would find. The video opened with the empty hallway. The timestamp showed 2:47:23 a.m. I watched for 10 seconds, 20. The corridor remained empty. At the 30-second mark, the feed suddenly pixelated, squares of corrupted data spreading across the screen like a digital infection. The image froze. The audio track cut out. Then the video jumped forward, skipping to 2:51:14 a.m., showing the empty hallway once again before the recording ended. 4 minutes of footage, gone, corrupted. The exact 4 minutes when the man had been standing in the hallway. I played it again. Same result. The corruption was clean, surgical. It erased only the portions that mattered, leaving the before and after intact as if to prove I hadn't imagined the notification, hadn't imagined opening the app and seeing something there. Over the following week, it happened 3 more times, always between 2 and 4 a.m. Always the same sequence. Notification, live feed showing the figure in the hallway, the gradual approach toward my door, then corrupted footage when I tried to review the recording. Each time I watched through the app as he came closer. Each time, he seemed to move differently, as if experimenting with how to approach. Sometimes he'd stop and start. Sometimes he'd stand in one place for minutes before advancing. Once, he raised his hand toward the camera, fingers splayed, and I could see that his palm was too pale, the skin stretched tight and bloodless. I tried to show the landlord. Mr. Chen lived on the ground floor and generally avoided dealing with tenant issues unless money or property damage was involved. When I knocked on his door, he answered in a bathrobe, squinting at me through thick glasses. The corrupted videos wouldn't play on my phone. Each time I tried to open them in his presence, the app crashed. He suggested I get more sleep, perhaps see someone about stress. The look in his eyes suggested he thought I was using substances I shouldn't be. I tried to explain the live feeds, the notifications, but without evidence my words sounded hollow, even to my own ears. A man stands in the hallway at night. He comes closer each time. He knows I'm watching. How could that sound like anything but paranoia? The ramblings of someone cracking under the weight of isolation and sleepless nights. That's when I started doubting myself. The logical part of my brain, the part that had earned a degree in engineering and prided itself on rational thinking, began to construct alternative explanations. Maybe there was no man. Maybe the motion sensor was malfunctioning, triggering false notifications. Maybe I was seeing patterns in static, the way humans see faces in wood grain or clouds. Maybe the stress of the new job, the loneliness of living in a city where I knew no one, the isolation of this creaking boarding house full of strangers was causing me to hallucinate. I stopped checking the live feeds when the notifications came. I'd silence my phone and roll over, forcing myself to believe there was nothing there. Nothing to see, nothing watching. But the notifications kept coming. 2:14 a.m., 2:33 a.m., 3:47 a.m. Like clockwork, My phone would buzz, and I'd lie there in the darkness, knowing that if I looked, he'd be there. Closer than before. Always closer. On the 10th night, I broke. The notification came at 2:52 a.m., and I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, some compulsion stronger than fear driving me to look. He was at my door, not standing in the hallway, not approaching from a distance. He was directly in front of the camera, inches away, his face filling the entire screen. I could see every detail now in the night vision's stark clarity. His skin was wrong, too smooth, like porcelain or plastic. His eyes were open but empty, nothing behind them but darkness. His mouth, when it opened, revealed something I couldn't process, some geometry of tongue and throat that didn't align with human anatomy. And he was smiling. I dropped the phone. It hit the floor with a crack, the screen facing down. In the silence that followed, I heard it again, that breathing sound from beyond the door. Slow, steady, patient. Then came the knock. 3 soft raps against the wood, polite, almost tentative, the sound a visitor might make, not wanting to disturb too forcefully. I didn't move, couldn't move. My body had locked up, every muscle rigid with a terror so profound it transcended physical sensation. The knock came again. 3 raps, same rhythm, same gentle pressure. "I know you're awake," said a voice from the hallway. It was wrong. The tone, the timbre, the way it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It sounded like a human voice played backwards and then forwards again, leaving some distortion in the reversal. It sounded like my voice, but not quite. Like a recording of myself that I didn't remember making. "I see you watching," the voice continued. "Every night, watching through your little camera, watching through the screen, but you never open the door. Why don't you open the door?" My phone buzzed on the floor, another notification. Motion detected, as if the camera itself was insisting I look, demanding I witness whatever was happening in the hallway. "I'm getting closer," the voice said, and now it definitely sounded like me. My inflection, my cadence. "Every night I'm getting closer. Every time you watch, I can come a little bit nearer. That's how it works. The watching creates a bridge. Your attention is a door, and I'm almost through." The breathing sound grew louder, not from the hallway anymore, from inside my room, from the space behind me. I turned slowly, certain I would see him there, standing in the corner or beside the window or at the foot of my bed. But the room was empty, just my sparse furniture in the pre-dawn darkness. Yet the breathing continued, surrounding me, coming from the walls themselves. "Tomorrow night," the voice said from the hallway. "Tomorrow night I think you'll open the door. I think you'll want to see if I'm real. If any of this is real. That's what you're wondering now, isn't it? Whether you've lost your mind, whether this is happening or if you're having a breakdown. The uncertainty is worse than knowing, isn't it?" The voice was right. The not knowing had become unbearable. The constant questioning of my own sanity, the isolation, the fear that I was constructing an elaborate delusion. Part of me wanted to fling the door open, to confront whatever was there, to prove to myself one way or the other what was real. But I didn't. I stayed frozen on my bed, listening to that impossible breathing, until the sun rose and the sounds finally stopped. The next day, I made a decision. I packed my essentials into a duffel bag. I went to Mr. Chen and told him I was leaving, breaking my lease, and he could keep the security deposit. He didn't argue. Perhaps he saw something in my face that suggested arguing would be pointless. I left the Ring camera mounted outside my door. Let it watch an empty room. Let it record whatever came in the night, looking for someone who was no longer there to watch. But as I walked down the stairs, duffel bag over my shoulder, my phone buzzed in my pocket. One last notification. Motion detected. Room 7. I didn't look. I kept walking. Out the front door, down the street, away from the boarding house and whatever waited in its hallways. 3 weeks later, I live in a new apartment across town. Ground floor. No hallway. No cameras. I tell myself I made the right choice. I tell myself I escaped something, though I'm never quite sure what. But sometimes, late at night, my phone will buzz with a notification from an app I thought I'd deleted. Motion detected. And when I check my app library, there it is. The Ring camera, still broadcasting from room 7, still mounted outside a door I no longer live behind. I've never opened the app to see what it's recording, never looked at the live feed. I tell myself I don't need to know, that not watching is what keeps me safe. But the notifications keep coming. Every night, around 2:47 a.m., my phone will buzz, and I'll lie awake in my new bed, in my new room, wondering if distance matters at all, wondering if the watching created something permanent, wondering if I can ever truly stop paying attention. And sometimes, in those late hours, I hear breathing in my new room. Slow, steady, patient, getting closer. Story 6. The lease was crystal clear. 2 bedrooms, 2 tenants, split utilities. I signed without hesitation. The apartment sat 3 blocks from campus. Rent was reasonable, and my supposed roommate seemed ideal. Quiet, never around during the day, respectful of boundaries. Perfect for someone trying to finish their dissertation in peace. I never actually met him during the showing. The landlord mentioned he worked night shifts, kept odd hours. I'd glimpsed him exactly twice in those first 3 weeks. A silhouette slipping into the second bedroom as I returned from the library, always with his back to me, always in that same dark jacket. The door would click shut before I could call out a greeting. His room sat at the end of the narrow hallway, mine closest to the living area. Between us, a bathroom we apparently never used at the same time, and a kitchen where I never found evidence of his meals. The building itself felt wrong from the beginning, though I attributed that to the architecture. Built in the 1960s, it possessed that peculiar institutional quality: cinder block walls painted over dozens of times, fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache, hallways that seemed to stretch longer at night. The apartment's layout amplified this unease. A shotgun-style configuration where you could see straight through from the front door to the back wall, every room a way station to the next. The landlord had installed a large mirror in the entryway, presumably to make the space feel larger. It succeeded only in creating the constant sensation of being watched by your own reflection. I noticed the sounds first. Not loud, never loud. Soft conversational murmurs seeping through the wall adjoining our bedrooms, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. Male voices, I thought, though the words remained indistinct, like listening to a television through water. I'd press my ear to the cold wall, straining to make sense of the cadence. But the moment I focused, the sounds would fade to nothing. I convinced myself he was watching movies with the volume low, talking on the phone, living his life as quietly as I lived mine. The rent check provided the first crack in this comfortable fiction. I'd placed my half in the landlord's mailbox on the 1st of the month, as instructed. On the 3rd, I received a text asking if I was having financial trouble, if I needed to discuss the payment. Confused, I called him immediately. "I dropped the check Tuesday," I said. $250 like always. Silence stretched across the line, punctuated by static. "The full amount is $250, he replied slowly. "You're the sole tenant. Have been since you moved in." My throat constricted. "But the lease says 2 bedrooms, two bedrooms, yes. 1 tenant. You signed a standard individual lease. There's no one else on the paperwork." I stood in the kitchen, phone trembling against my ear, staring down that long hallway toward the closed door of the 2nd bedroom. "Then who? Is someone staying with you? Because that's a violation of the lease terms. You need my written permission for overnight guests beyond 72 hours. "No, I thought someone else lived here." Another pause. "The previous tenant moved out 6 weeks before you arrived. The apartment was empty when you toured it. Are you feeling all right?" I assured him I was fine, apologized for the confusion, and ended the call. Then I walked to the 2nd bedroom door and knocked. The sound echoed wrong, too hollow, too resonant. No one answered. I tried the handle. locked from the inside. Through the gap at the bottom, I could see the lights were off. That night, I sat in my room with the door open, watching the hallway, watching that door. At 2:47 a.m., I heard the distinctive sound of a key turning in a lock. The second bedroom door opened. I saw the handle turn, saw the door swing inward on its hinges, but the hallway remained empty. Just that yawning darkness where a room waited. Then the door closed, softly, deliberately. I didn't sleep. The next morning I examined the door in daylight. Standard builder-grade hollow core, brass handle, no visible damage. I checked the lock mechanism, functional, though it required a key from the outside and could be locked from within by turning a small latch. When I pressed my face close to the gap between door and frame, I detected a smell I couldn't quite place. Not decay, nothing so obvious. Something like old paper and copper, and the particular mustiness of clothes left too long in a sealed drawer. I started making notes. Times I heard sounds. Times I thought I saw movement. Times I felt that crawling sensation between my shoulder blades that screams about unseen eyes. The list grew longer. The sounds became more frequent, and I began to notice the small disarrangements. Items moved, never far. A coffee mug shifted 3 inches to the left on the counter, a book repositioned on the shelf, my toothbrush facing the opposite direction in its holder. The kind of changes you could dismiss as your own forgetfulness, each one individually meaningless. Collectively, they formed a pattern of presence, of someone sharing this space, touching my things with invisible fingers. The conversations through the wall grew louder, still indistinct, but now I could separate 2 voices, one deeper, one higher, and more insistent. Sometimes they sounded argumentative. Sometimes they laughed, and that was worse, because the laughter felt directed outward, toward me, though I understood this was paranoia talking. I was sleeping poorly. My dissertation sat untouched. I'd started keeping my bedroom door locked at night, a chair wedged beneath the handle, though I couldn't articulate what I was protecting myself from. I ordered a wireless security camera, the kind marketed for keeping an eye on pets or package deliveries. I mounted it in the hallway, angled to capture both bedroom doors and the stretch of corridor between. The mirror in the entryway reflected back at the lens, creating an infinite regression of hallways and doors, each one slightly smaller and darker than the last. The first 3 nights of footage showed nothing. Empty hallways, stationary doors, my own brief appearances moving to and from the bathroom. I'd gotten the camera working on Wednesday. By Saturday, I'd almost convinced myself I was experiencing some kind of breakdown brought on by isolation and stress. I'd schedule an appointment with the campus counseling center on Monday, maybe get a prescription for something to help me sleep. Sunday morning, I reviewed the footage from Saturday night. At 2:51 a.m., the second bedroom door opened. The handle turned, the door swung inward, exactly as I'd seen before. The camera recorded the movement clearly, hinges pivoting, darkness beyond the threshold. But the hallway remained empty. No hand on the handle, no figure crossing the space. Nothing. Then I noticed the mirror. I had to rewind several times, enlarge the image, but there was no mistaking it. In the reflection, clear as daylight, a man stood in the hallway. Tall, wearing that dark jacket I'd glimpsed before. He faced away from the camera, hand extended toward the door handle, opening the door that opened itself in the real hallway. Then he stepped through. The reflection stepped through, while the actual doorway remained empty and dark. The door closed. The reflection disappeared. I watched the clip 17 times. I checked the camera settings, searched for explanations about digital artifacts or reflective anomalies. I found nothing that explained why a mirror would show something that wasn't there. Or perhaps something that was there but existed only in reflection, visible only in that reversed world trapped in glass. I didn't leave my room for the rest of the day. I sat with my back against the wall, laptop open, playing and replaying those 60 seconds of footage. As evening dimmed to night, I became aware of sounds from the second bedroom. Not voices this time. Footsteps, the creak of bed springs, the sound of drawers opening and closing. Someone moving through their nightly routine on the other side of the wall. getting ready for sleep while I sat paralyzed with terror in my locked room. At some point I must have dozed off, because I woke to my phone buzzing with a notification from the camera app. Motion detected. I opened the feed with shaking hands. The hallway was dark except for the emergency exit sign's red glow at the far end. In the frame, my own bedroom door stood slightly ajar. I stared at the screen, trying to remember if I'd left it open, knowing with sickening certainty that I'd locked it, wedged the chair, checked it twice before sitting down. As I watched, the door opened wider, smooth and slow, as if someone on the other side was pushing it carefully, trying not to make noise. The chair I'd wedged beneath the handle sat several feet away, neatly positioned against the wall. In the mirror's reflection, I could see into my room, could see my own sleeping form on the bed, one arm dangling over the side, could see the figure standing beside my bed looking down at me. I threw myself backward, slamming into the wall behind me, a strangled sound escaping my throat. But I was alone in the room. The door was locked. The chair remained in place. When I looked at my phone again, the feed showed only an empty hallway, both doors closed, everything as it should be. Except I knew what I'd seen. Someone standing over me while I slept. Someone who existed only in reflection, only in that mirrored dimension running parallel to reality. Someone who'd been living here all along, occupying the same space, separated by nothing more than the thin membrane between what is and what's reflected. I left that night, threw clothes into a bag, grabbed my laptop and walked out. I slept in my car in a campus parking lot, too afraid to return, too embarrassed to explain to anyone what had driven me out. When morning came, I called the landlord and said I needed to break the lease, effective immediately. I'd pay whatever penalties were required. He sighed, a sound of resignation rather than anger. "You're the third one," he said quietly. "Third tenant in 2 years who couldn't finish their lease in that unit. I should have told you, should have disclosed it. But legally I don't have to, since nothing concrete has ever happened." "What do you mean, the third?" "The apartment's been split for 5 years. Before that, it was a single large unit. 1 bedroom. That's where he lived. The previous tenant, before I bought the building." Another pause. "He died in there. Natural causes, they said. Heart failure. He was alone. It took 3 weeks before anyone noticed." My hands felt numb. "Which room?" "The one at the end of the hall. The second bedroom." The landlord cleared his throat. The coroner's report said something odd, though. When they found him, he was facing the wall-length mirror that used to be in that room, had his hand pressed against it. They assumed he'd been looking at himself when it happened, but he trailed off. But what? The way his hand was positioned, the angle, it wasn't like he was touching his own reflection. It was like he was trying to reach through. Or maybe... The landlord's voice dropped. Maybe like he was trying to push something back. I never returned to the apartment. The landlord agreed to have my belongings packed and shipped to a storage unit. I stayed with a friend, then found a new place, a studio apartment in a building with no mirrors, no roommates, no dark hallways stretching toward unseen rooms. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself looking at reflective surfaces, windows, computer screens gone black, the polished surface of my phone, and I wonder if I'm seeing myself, or if something else is looking back, wearing my face, living in that reversed world where it's always 2:47 a.m., and doors open into darkness and someone stands beside your bed while you sleep. I wonder if it's still in that apartment, waiting for the next tenant, or if it followed me. If the figure I occasionally glimpse in the corner of reflective surfaces, always facing away, always just leaving the frame, is something I brought with me from that place. I wonder if the man in the dark jacket ever found what he was looking for on the other side of that mirror, or if he's still reaching, still trying to cross over, hands pressed against the cold glass barrier between worlds. I wonder, most of all, which side of the mirror I'm really on. Last week I passed the old building. "New tenant," the landlord mentioned in a brief text. Someone from the graduate program in psychology, studying isolation and environmental stressors. I almost warned them, almost sent a message explaining what waits in that second bedroom. What lives in the space between reality and reflection? But how do you explain something you don't understand yourself? How do you warn someone about a roommate who doesn't exist, who's never existed, except in mirrors and photographs in that liminal space where perception fractures into uncertainty? Instead, I deleted the message. They'd figure it out themselves. Everyone does, eventually. Or maybe they wouldn't see anything at all. Maybe it chooses who can perceive it, who gets pulled into its reality. Maybe I was always meant to see him, to exist in that overlapping space where two worlds bleed together. The camera still sends me notifications sometimes, even though I canceled the subscription months ago. Motion detected. I never open them. I'm afraid of what I might see in the saved footage. Afraid I'll see myself still there, still living in that apartment, while some reflection of me walks around out here thinking it escaped. I'm afraid that the door at the end of the hall never stopped opening and closing, and that one night I walked through it without realizing, stepping from the real world into the reflected one, and everything since then has been the dream of something trapped behind glass, pressing its hands against the barrier and hoping someone on the other side can see it. The worst part is not knowing. Not knowing if the man in the dark jacket was trying to escape into my world, or if he was trying to drag me into his. Not knowing if the voices I heard through the wall were conversations he was having with someone else or if they were my own thoughts, echoing back to me from that other place. Not knowing if I'm writing this in a studio apartment in the real world or in a locked bedroom at the end of a dark hallway. Convinced I'm free while something wearing my reflection lives the life I think I'm living. Sometimes I stand in front of the bathroom mirror and hold up my hand. My reflection mirrors the movement perfectly, as it should. But if I focus on the background, on the space behind my reflected shoulder, I can almost see it. A doorway that isn't there in my actual apartment, slightly ajar. Darkness beyond it. And sometimes, just for a moment, I think I see someone standing in that doorway, facing away from me. Always facing away, wearing a dark jacket, waiting. Story 7. The first call came at 2:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd been staring at my phone for the past hour, unable to sleep in the oppressive humidity that settled over the house each night. The suburbs promised quiet, promised peace after years of cramped apartment living. But what I got instead was this sagging rental with its water-stained ceilings and the perpetual smell of old wood that no amount of air freshener could mask. The phone vibrated against my chest and I nearly dropped it. Unknown number. Video call. My thumb hovered over the decline button. Who the hell video calls at this hour? But something made me answer. Maybe it was the insomnia talking. Maybe it was the part of my brain that always expects bad news at odd hours. The screen flickered to black, then resolved into something that made my stomach clench. Darkness, yes, but not empty darkness. The camera was moving, shaking slightly, like someone walking with their phone held low. I could make out wooden beams, thick with dust and cobwebs that caught the faint light from somewhere. The angle was all wrong, pointing downward at an oblique angle, and in the background I heard it, breathing, heavy, labored, like someone struggling with emphysema or working hard at something physical. Hello? My voice came out hoarse. The breathing continued. The camera panned slowly and my blood went cold. Through gaps in what I now recognized as floorboards, I could see down into a room. My room. My living room with its thrift store couch and the standing lamp I'd left on because I hated coming home to darkness. The angle was impossible. Looking straight down from above, from somewhere that shouldn't exist. I lived in a single-story house. The landlord had been explicit about it when I signed the lease 6 months ago. No attic access, he'd said, gesturing vaguely upward. Sealed off years ago. Structural issues, nothing to worry about, but we can't have anyone up there. Insurance, you understand. I'd understood. I'd been desperate enough for cheap rent that I would have agreed to almost anything. The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my reflection in the black screen. My face looked gaunt in the phone's dim light, eyes too wide, skin too pale. I sat there for a long time, listening to the house settle around me, every creak suddenly ominous. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a wrong number, some kind of prank, or maybe just a glitch. Phones did strange things sometimes. I didn't sleep that night. The second call came 3 days later, at 3:15 p.m. this time, while I was eating a late lunch at the kitchen table. Daylight should have made it less frightening, but somehow it was worse. The video showed the same space, those wooden beams, that suffocating darkness. But now I could see more details. Old electrical wiring snaked along the joists. Pink insulation poked through in places, looking disturbingly organic. And there, unmistakable through the gaps in the floorboards, my kitchen table, me sitting at it, phone in hand, staring down at my screen while my image on that screen stared up at something above. The perspective made my head hurt. I was looking at myself, and somewhere in the attic that didn't exist, that couldn't exist, something was watching, recording, breathing. I ended the call and immediately tried calling back. The number rang endlessly, no voicemail, no answer. I searched for it online, ran it through every reverse lookup service I could find. Nothing. The number didn't exist in any database, as if it had materialized from nowhere just to reach me. That evening, I stood in the hallway and stared up at the ceiling. The house had been built in the 1960s, typical suburban construction of the era. The ceiling was low, just 8 feet, and there was no visible access panel anywhere. No pull-down ladder, no trapdoor, nothing. I went outside and looked at the roof line. Single story, exactly as I'd been told. The peak of the roof was low, maybe 12 feet from the ground. Even if there was space up there, it would be barely enough to crawl through, not stand. So where had that video been taken? I tried to talk myself down. Maybe it was a neighbor with a weird sense of humor, editing videos to mess with me. Maybe my landlord had cameras installed without telling me. Illegal, sure, but possible. Maybe I was losing my mind. That last option felt increasingly plausible as the days wore on and sleep became more elusive. The calls kept coming. Not every day, but often enough that I started to dread the sight of my phone lighting up. Sometimes during the day, sometimes at night. Always video. Always that same claustrophobic view of wooden beams and shadows. Always with that ragged breathing in the background. And always, somewhere in the frame, a view down into my house. My bedroom while I slept. My bathroom while I showered. The steam obscuring the camera lens slightly. My living room while I sat on the couch, trying to lose myself in television shows I couldn't concentrate on. I stopped answering after the first week, but the calls kept coming. My voicemail would fill up with darkness and breathing. I blocked the number. New numbers appeared. I stopped using my phone entirely for anything but emergencies, but that just meant I'd come home to find dozens of missed video calls, all from numbers that didn't exist, all presumably showing the same impossible footage. The worst part wasn't the calls themselves. The worst part was knowing that something, someone, was up there, above me, always above me, watching, recording, breathing. I examined every inch of the ceiling, looking for cracks, holes, any sign of access. I found nothing. The drywall was old but intact, painted over so many times that the texture was smoothed almost flat. I knocked on it in places, listening for hollow spaces, but the sound was always the same dull thud. No echo, no emptiness, just solid ceiling and whatever lay beyond it. On a Friday afternoon, desperate and half convinced I was suffering some kind of elaborate breakdown, I called the landlord. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice wary. He knew who I was, the tenant in the problem house, the one that never seemed to stay rented for long. The attic, I said without preamble. I need to know about the attic. Silence on the other end, long enough that I thought he might have hung up. There is no attic, he said finally. I told you when you moved in, sealed off. Why? What's up there? Structural damage. The previous owner was going to convert it to living space, started the work, then abandoned it. Inspector said the beams are compromised. It's not safe. It's sealed. Forget about it. Can you unseal it? I need to. No. Firm, absolute. Lease violation if you try to access it yourself. It's dangerous, and my insurance doesn't cover it. Leave it alone. He hung up before I could argue further. That night, I sat in the living room with all the lights on, staring at the ceiling. The paint was yellowed in places, water stains spreading like bruises across the plaster. How had I not noticed before? The house was full of these small signs of decay, of secrets hidden just beneath the surface. My phone rang. Video call. Unknown number. I didn't answer, but I watched it ring and ring, the screen lighting up my face in the too bright room. When it went to voicemail, I could almost feel the weight of something's attention pressing down from above. The ceiling seemed lower than before, oppressive, like being inside a coffin. I started spending more time away from the house. I'd leave early for work, arrive after everyone else. I'd stay late, volunteering for projects I didn't care about. I'd go to coffee shops and sit for hours with a single lukewarm drink, watching strangers live their normal lives, wondering if any of them had something breathing above them, watching them sleep. But I always had to go home eventually. The calls evolved. Instead of just showing me footage from above, they started showing me things I couldn't explain. My living room, empty, but with objects moved slightly. A book on a different shelf. A cushion displaced on the couch. The kitchen, my coffee mug sitting on the counter. I could have sworn I'd put it in the dishwasher that morning. My bedroom, the closet door open a crack when I always kept it closed. Were these videos from the future? Was something up there moving through my house while I was gone? Or had it always been there, moving things while I slept, while I showered, while I stared at my phone trying to understand what was happening to me? I set up my laptop to record while I was gone, pointed at the living room. When I came home and checked the footage, there were gaps. Not long ones, just a few seconds here and there, barely noticeable, but present, as if something had reached down through the ceiling and paused the recording, as if the thing that lived above didn't want to be documented. 3 weeks after the first call, I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of creaking overhead, not the normal settling of the house, but deliberate, rhythmic. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps, back and forth, directly above my bedroom. I lay frozen in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, listening to whatever was up there pacing. The footsteps stopped directly above me and stayed there, and I had the overwhelming sensation of being observed, of something's gaze boring down through the drywall and insulation and wooden joists, pinning me like an insect to my mattress. My phone rang. Video call. In the darkness of my bedroom, the screen's glow was blinding. I answered. The image was different this time. Instead of the wide shots of the attic space, the camera was pressed close to the floorboards, peering down through a gap. I could see my bedroom below, could see myself lying in bed, phone held up to my face, the light painting my features in harsh relief. The breathing was louder now, excited, almost eager. And then slowly, the camera panned to the side, showing more of the attic space around the person, the thing, holding the phone. I saw movement in the shadows, not just one shape, but many, undefined, shifting, pressed into the corners and against the beams. How many were up there? How long had they been there? The breathing turned into something else. Not quite laughter, but close. A wet, rattling sound that made my skin crawl. I ended the call and ran. Not out of the house. Where would I go at 3 a.m? But to the hallway. I stood there in my boxer shorts, hyperventilating, staring up at the ceiling. The footsteps had stopped. The house was silent except for my own ragged breathing, which sounded disturbingly similar to the breathing on the phone. "What do you want?" I screamed at the ceiling. The house offered no answer. In the morning, exhausted and probably half insane, I went to the hardware store and bought a ladder, a crowbar, and a high-powered flashlight. The landlord could evict me if he wanted. I didn't care anymore. I needed to know what was up there. I needed to see it, to prove it was real, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. Back at the house, I set up the ladder in the hallway, beneath the spot where I thought I'd heard the footsteps. I pressed my hands against the ceiling, feeling for seams, for weak points. Nothing. The drywall was solid, unyielding. I climbed higher on the ladder, pressed my ear against it. Silence. Not even the usual sounds of an attic. No skittering of rodents, no whisper of wind through gaps. Just silence, thick and suffocating. I raised the crowbar, positioned it against the ceiling, ready to pry and tear and rip until I found whatever was hiding above me. My phone rang. I nearly fell off the ladder. Video call. Unknown number. Some instinct made me answer, made me look at what was being shown to me. The camera showed my hallway from above, showed me standing on the ladder, phone in one hand, crowbar in the other. But the angle was impossible. There was no gap in the ceiling where the camera could be positioned. The image showed the ceiling intact, solid, and yet somehow the camera was on the other side of it, looking down at me looking at it. And in the background, that breathing. Closer now, right above my head. I looked up from my phone, stared at the ceiling inches from my face. The paint was cracked there, fine lines spreading like a web. As I watched, the cracks widened, small flakes of paint drifting down to land on my upturned face. Something was pressing down from the other side, pressing hard, and the ceiling was beginning to give way. The breathing on the phone grew louder, faster, excited. I dropped the crowbar. It clattered down the ladder, hit the floor with a bang that echoed through the house. I climbed down slowly, carefully, never taking my eyes off the ceiling. The cracks had stopped spreading, but they were there now, visible, undeniable. Proof that something existed in the space above, the space that shouldn't exist, the space the landlord swore was sealed off. My phone was still connected to the call. On the screen, the camera slowly panned away from the hallway, moved through the darkness of the attic space. I saw more of it now. Saw old furniture piled in corners, a broken mirror reflecting nothing, stacks of boxes with their contents spilling out. Saw the floorboards stretching away into shadow, and between the boards, dozens of gaps, dozens of vantage points looking down into my house. The camera stopped moving, pointed down through a gap. My living room below, perfectly framed, the view I'd seen in so many of these calls. And there, at the edge of the frame, barely visible in the darkness, a hand. Pale, too long, wrong somehow in proportions I couldn't quite define. The hand reached down through the gap, fingers extending toward the room below, toward my space, reaching, almost touching. The call ended. I stood in the hallway, phone clutched in my sweating hand, staring up at the cracked ceiling. The house was silent, too silent. No creaking, no settling, no breathing. Just the absence of sound, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting. That was 3 days ago. I haven't left the house since. I'm not sure I can. Every time I approach the front door, my phone rings. Every time I look away from the ceiling, I hear footsteps overhead. The cracks are spreading, slowly but steadily, spiderwebbing across the plaster. I've stopped sleeping. I sit in the living room with all the lights on, watching the ceiling, waiting for it to finally give way and reveal what's been up there all along. The calls keep coming. Sometimes I answer. The footage is always the same now. The attic space, the gaps in the floorboards, the view down into my house. But there's something new in the most recent calls. In the shadows, in the background, I can see movement. Not one shape, but dozens. Maybe more. All of them gathered up there. All of them watching me through the gaps. All of them breathing in perfect synchronization. My phone is ringing again. Video call. Unknown number. I already know what I'll see if I answer. I already know what's waiting up there. What's always been waiting. What will continue waiting long after I'm gone. The ceiling creaks above me. A fine dust of plaster drifts down, catches in my hair, lands on my shoulders like snow. I can feel the weight of all that attention pressing down. Feel the space above me, the space that doesn't exist, growing heavier, denser, more present. I'm going to answer the call. I have to, because the worst part isn't what's up there in the attic. The worst part is not knowing if it was ever really up there at all. The worst part is wondering if it's always been down here with me. If I've been calling myself this whole time. If I'm the one who's been breathing on the other end of the line. The ceiling cracks again, louder this time. Plaster falls in chunks now, exposing dark wood beneath. My thumb hovers over the answer button. The breathing starts even before I accept the call. Wet, heavy, familiar. It's coming from my own throat, I realize. It's always been coming from my own throat. I look up at the spreading cracks, at the darkness beyond, and I finally understand. There is no attic. There never was. There's only the space between what I know and what I'm willing to believe, and something has been living in that space for longer than I can remember. The phone screen goes dark, reflecting my face back at me. In the reflection, I'm smiling. I don't remember starting to smile. Above me, the ceiling begins to breathe. Story 8. The smartwatch arrived in a plain cardboard box. No frills, no promises beyond the basics. Sleep tracking, heart rate monitoring, ambient sound recording. I'd bought it on impulse during a late-night scroll through discount electronics, the kind of purchase you justify by calling it self-care, when really it's just curiosity wrapped in a $60 price tag. The first 3 nights yielded exactly what I expected. Flat lines of silence punctuated by my own snoring, the occasional creak of settling floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The app displayed it all in neat little graphs, color-coded and clinical. Green for peaceful, yellow for minor disturbances, red for, that's where it started. Night 4 showed a crimson spike at 4:17 a.m. The graph peaked violently, a sudden mountain range erupting from the valley of my sleep. I almost dismissed it, figured maybe I'd knocked something over in my sleep. Maybe the neighbors had gotten into another fight. But the app had a playback feature, and my thumb found it before my brain could suggest leaving well enough alone. The recording began with the white noise of my bedroom at night. My breathing, rhythmic and deep. The soft mechanical whir of the watch itself, perched on my nightstand where I'd left it charging. Then, clear as breaking glass, footsteps, not the muffled thumps of someone walking in the apartment above. These were close, intimate, the precise sound of bare feet on my bedroom's hardwood floor. I played it 3 times, each repetition tightening the knot in my chest. The steps moved from near the door toward my bed, paused, then continued past where the watch sat recording, toward my closet. The sound of fabric rustling. Then silence resumed, broken only by my own undisturbed breathing. I checked every lock that morning, front door, deadbolt engaged, windows sealed, security bars in place. The building's entrance camera showed nothing unusual between midnight and 6 a.m., just the superintendent leaving for his pre-dawn walk, same as always. I told myself it had to be an audio glitch, some kind of interference from a neighbor's television, or the pipes in the walls playing tricks with acoustics. But I wore the watch that night anyway. Night 5 brought 2 spikes. The first at 3:52 a.m. captured what sounded like someone trying the handle of my bedroom door. The slow, careful testing of someone who doesn't want to be heard. The brass fixture squeaked. I'd been meaning to oil it for months, and then released. Footsteps again, these heavier, more purposeful. They crossed the room and stopped where I kept my backpack hanging from a chair. The sound of a zipper being drawn open made my mouth go dry when I listened to it the next morning. Slow, tooth by tooth, the deliberate action of someone searching through my belongings. Papers rustled, something metallic clinked. Then the zipper closed with the same agonizing patience, and the footsteps retreated. I tore through my backpack immediately. Everything appeared untouched. My wallet still contained the same $43. My keys, my work badge, the half-empty pack of gum, all exactly where I'd left them. No signs of disturbance, no items missing or rearranged. The logical part of my brain screamed explanations. Audio artifacts, crossed signals, some weird malfunction in the watch's cheap microphone. But I'd started checking the locks compulsively. Before bed, yes, but also at random intervals throughout the evening. I'd get up from the couch, walk to the door, test the handle, confirm the deadbolt, return to whatever I'd been doing. 10 minutes later, the urge would strike again. Each time, everything remained secure. Each time, the relief lasted shorter than before. The second spike from night 5 came at 4:31 a.m. Kitchen sounds. The distinctive metallic scrape of my silverware drawer being opened, the clatter of utensils being moved around. Then, water running. Not the sustained flow of someone filling a glass or washing dishes, but brief spurts, irregular, almost curious, as if someone were testing the faucet, learning how it worked. I stopped sleeping properly after that, would lie in bed with my eyes open, watching the darkness, listening for any sound that matched the recordings. My bedroom became a different place at night, familiar objects transforming into ambiguous shapes in the blackness. The dresser could be someone standing still. The coat hanging from the closet door could be a figure waiting. Every ambient noise, the building settling, the wind against the windows, my own pulse thundering in my ears, became a potential threat. During the day, I functioned on autopilot. Work colleagues commented that I looked tired. I blamed allergies, a stomach bug, anything but the truth. How do you explain that you're afraid of sounds that apparently only your watch can hear? That something might be entering your locked apartment every night while you sleep, conducting some unknowable inventory of your life? I bought additional locks, installed a chain on the door, added a security bar across the bottom, placed a chair under the handle for good measure. The superintendent gave me a strange look when he saw the new hardware, but said nothing. The building was old enough that tenants doing their own reinforcements wasn't unusual. Night 6, I stayed awake until 3 a.m., watching the bedroom door from my bed, fighting to keep my eyes open, convincing myself that if I could just witness whatever was happening, I'd understand it, could categorize it, could stop it. But exhaustion is patient, and eventually, it dragged me under. The watch recorded 4 spikes that night. The first 3 followed the now familiar pattern. Footsteps, sounds of someone moving through my space, the bathroom door creaking open, water running again, the medicine cabinet opening and closing. Each sound precise and clear, the audio quality good enough that I could identify the exact locations, match them to specific objects and fixtures in my apartment. The 4th spike was different. It came at 4:47 a.m., just as the darkness outside began its first dilution toward dawn. The recording started normally, my breathing, the ambient room tone. Then something changed in the audio quality itself. A presence, not announced by footsteps or movement, but by a sudden weight in the sound, as if the air had thickened. Breathing, not mine, which continued its slow rhythm in the background. This was closer to the microphone, deliberate and controlled. Someone standing directly over my nightstand where the watch sat. The breathing continued for 12 seconds, each inhalation audible, each exhalation measured. Then, my name. Not shouted or whispered, but spoken in a conversational tone, intimate and familiar. A voice I almost recognized but couldn't place, rough and low, the way someone sounds when they've just woken up. It said my name once, clearly, then a pause, then again, slightly different in inflection as if testing different pronunciations. The breathing resumed for another 8 seconds, then footsteps retreating toward the bedroom door. The sound of the door opening, that familiar squeak of hinges I heard a dozen times a day. The door closing, silence. I didn't move from bed for an hour after listening to the recording. Just sat there, phone in hand, replaying those 18 seconds over and over. The voice wasn't threatening exactly, but it carried an intimacy that felt like violation. This wasn't random sounds or audio glitches. This was directed, personal. Someone, or something, knew I was there, knew my name, knew where I kept the watch that would record it. The rational explanations I'd been clinging to began to fracture. I checked the building cameras again, scrolling through days of footage. Nothing. No one entering or leaving the building who didn't belong there. No signs of forced entry. No suspicious figures lurking in the stairwells or hallways. The superintendent confirmed all exterior doors had been locked and alarmed overnight. I considered the possibility that I was doing this myself, sleepwalking, talking in my sleep, creating the sounds I was later afraid of. I'd read about parasomnia, people who performed complex actions while unconscious. Maybe I was getting up, walking around, speaking my own name, then returning to bed with no memory of it. But the footsteps were wrong. Too heavy, too deliberate. And my voice didn't sound like that, didn't carry that rough timbre. I recorded myself speaking, played it back, tried to match the tone. It wasn't me. Or if it was, something fundamental about my voice changed during these episodes. I started leaving markers. Small objects placed strategically around the apartment that would be disturbed if someone, even sleepwalking me, moved through the space. A pencil balanced on the kitchen counter. Flour dusted lightly in front of the bedroom door. Thread stretched across the hallway entrance at ankle height. Night 7, I took sleeping pills. Strong ones. The kind that would knock me into unconsciousness deep enough that even sleepwalking should be impossible. I arranged my markers, set the watch recording, swallowed the pills with a full glass of water, and forced myself into bed. The medication hit like a hammer. One moment I was staring at the ceiling. The next I was clawing my way out of chemical darkness, head stuffed with cotton, mouth desert dry. Daylight filtered through the curtains. 11:37 a.m. according to my phone. I'd slept for 9 hours straight, the deepest sleep I'd had in weeks. The markers were undisturbed, the pencil still balanced. The flour showed only my own footprints from the night before. The thread remained unbroken, but the watch had recorded 6 spikes. The audio was different this time, clearer somehow, as if whatever was being recorded had moved closer to the microphone, or the watch's sensitivity had increased. I heard everything. The bedroom door opening, footsteps circling my bed. I could track them by sound, imagine the path they took around where I lay unconscious. The sound of breathing, close and regular. My closet opening, clothes hangers sliding on the rod, drawers being opened and closed in my dresser. Then the voice again, multiple times throughout the night. Sometimes saying my name, sometimes other words I couldn't quite make out. The syllables blurred or distorted. Once, it sounded like laughter, low and sustained. Once, a sigh, as if whoever was there had found something disappointing. The final spike, at 5:12 a.m., captured the sound of footsteps approaching the nightstand. A pause. Then something that made my blood crystallize. The sound of the watch being picked up. The audio became muffled, movement and friction, as if someone were examining it, turning it over in their hands. Then a voice, clear and close, because it was speaking directly into the microphone. "I know you're listening." The watch was set back down. Footsteps retreated. The bedroom door closed. That was 3 days ago. I haven't worn the watch since. It sits on my kitchen counter, powered off, its black screen reflecting nothing. But I can't bring myself to throw it away. Some part of me needs it, needs the evidence, the proof that something is happening, even if I can't explain what. The markers remain in place. I add more each night, creating an increasingly complex web of indicators that should reveal any movement through my space. So far, they remain pristine, undisturbed. The locks stay locked. The cameras show nothing. But I hear things now, even without the watch. Sounds I never noticed before, or sounds that were never there to begin with. The apartment has developed new acoustics, new settling patterns, new voices in the pipes. Or maybe I've just started listening more carefully to what was always present. Last night I lay awake until dawn. No medication, no watch, just my raw consciousness fighting against exhaustion. Somewhere around 4 a.m. I heard it, not through a recording or a device, just in the air around me. The bedroom door handle turning, that distinctive squeak of old brass, the sound of breathing that wasn't mine. I didn't open my eyes, couldn't make myself look. Just lay there, heart hammering, as footsteps crossed the room, as something moved through my space with familiar confidence, as the air shifted with presence. When I finally forced my eyes open as dawn leaked through the curtains, everything was exactly as it should be. Door closed, locks engaged, markers untouched. No evidence of anything except my own paranoia, my own deteriorating ability to distinguish between sound and silence, presence and absence. The watch still sits on the counter. Sometimes I think about charging it again, putting it on for just one more night. Getting one more recording that might explain everything or prove I've lost my grip on reality entirely. But I know what I'll hear. I know the sounds that are waiting in the darkness of my bedroom, the voice that knows my name, the footsteps that leave no trace. The question isn't whether something is there. The question is whether it's outside me or in. Whether these sounds emerge from some violation of my space or some fracture in my mind. Whether I'm being watched or watching myself come apart. I checked the locks again before writing this. Front door, secure. Windows, latched. Chain in place. Security bar wedged tight. All of it exactly as it should be. All of it meaningless against something that doesn't need doors, that exists in recordings and shadows, and the spaces between waking and sleep. Tonight I'll lie in bed again, without the watch, without witnesses. I'll listen to the darkness and wait for the sounds I know are coming. The footsteps, the breathing, the voice calling my name like an old friend, like something that's always been here, like something I've always known. And I won't know if I'm hearing it with my ears, or just with whatever part of me has learned to be afraid of the dark again, the way I was as a child, before I understood that the real terror isn't in the monsters under the bed. It's in not knowing if the monster is what's lurking in your room, or if it's the part of you that can't stop listening for it. The watch sits on the counter, powered off, silent, but I can still hear it recording. Story 9. The mirror came with the house. I remember the real estate agent mentioning it during the walkthrough, her hand gesturing vaguely toward the massive thing leaning against the living room wall. An antique, she'd said, left by the previous tenant. Victorian era, maybe older. The frame was ornate, dark wood carved with patterns that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. I should have asked why someone would abandon something so valuable. I should have wondered about a lot of things. But the rent was cheap, and the duplex was in a decent neighborhood, so I signed the lease without asking questions I probably should have asked. The mirror stayed. The first week passed quietly. I worked from home, my laptop set up on a desk facing away from that wall, the one I shared with the other half of the building. I'd seen the neighboring door once, painted the same faded blue as mine, but I'd never seen anyone use it. The mailbox next to it had no name. At night, I heard nothing through the wall. No footsteps, no television, no running water. Just silence. Thick and absolute. It was the silence that bothered me first, before anything else started. The mirror reflected most of my living room. The sagging couch I'd brought from my old apartment. The coffee table with its permanent ring stains. The window that looked out onto the street. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection while crossing the room and startle myself. That split-second confusion of seeing movement that was mine but felt separate, delayed. On the 8th night, I heard the first sound. A soft thud against the wall, right where the mirror leaned. I was reading on the couch, and the vibration traveled through the floorboards, subtle enough that I almost dismissed it. Almost. I set my book down and stared at the mirror's surface, watching my own face stare back, pale in the lamplight. Nothing moved. The room was perfectly still. I pressed my palm against the wall next to the mirror's frame. The plaster was cool, slightly damp. Old houses get like that sometimes, moisture seeping through. I told myself that. The wall was solid under my touch. No hollow spaces, no gaps. Just old plaster and whatever lay beyond it. Someone else's wall, someone else's room, someone else's life running parallel to mine with only this barrier between us. When I pulled my hand away, I could have sworn the mirror's surface rippled, just for a moment, like water disturbed by a stone. I didn't sleep well that night. The sounds became regular after that. Not every night, but often enough that I started anticipating them. Always after dark, always in that hour between midnight and 1, when the world outside went completely still. Sometimes it was that same dull thud, other times, a dragging sound, like furniture being moved slowly across a floor. Once, something that might have been footsteps, pacing back and forth, before stopping abruptly. I convinced myself I was hearing my neighbor, Finally. Someone lived there. Someone with odd hours and stranger habits. Maybe they worked nights. Maybe they were an artist who kept vampire hours. The explanations came easily during daylight, sitting at my desk with work emails piling up and the rational world humming along normally. But at night, pressing my ear against the wall in the darkness, hearing those sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the explanations dissolved like sugar in water. The mirror began to feel different in the room. I can't describe it better than that. Its presence became heavier, more insistent, as if it were pulling focus even when I wasn't looking at it. I started draping a sheet over it at night, telling myself it was because the reflections bothered me, but really I just couldn't stand the way it seemed to watch. 3 weeks in, I came home from a grocery run to find the sheet on the floor. I stood in the doorway, plastic bags cutting into my palms, staring at the crumpled fabric. I'd tucked it carefully behind the frame that morning. There was no draft in the room, no reason for it to fall. The mirror's surface was pristine, reflecting the late afternoon light streaming through my window. But the reflection looked wrong somehow. The angles were right, the furniture was in the correct positions, but something about the quality of the light, the way shadows fell. It was like looking at a photograph that had been slightly overexposed. I left the sheet on the floor. That night, the vibrations started. Not sounds anymore, but actual movement I could feel through the couch cushions, through the floor, through my bones. The mirror trembled against the wall, a barely perceptible shaking that made the reflection shiver. I sat frozen, watching the surface undulate like a membrane, like something living and breathing. And then I saw it, a shadow, moving within the reflection. Not my shadow. I was perfectly still, my hands gripping the couch armrest. This shadow moved independently, a dark figure that crossed behind my reflected self, passing through the reflected space of my living room with slow, deliberate steps. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but watch as this impossible thing walked through the mirror's world. And when it reached the edge of the frame, it stopped. Just stopped, and stood there, a human-shaped absence in the reflection. Then it turned toward me. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that shadow figure staring back at me. Time became elastic, meaningless. Eventually I managed to move, scrambling backward off the couch, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might vomit. The shadow didn't follow. It just stood there in the mirror's reflection, a dark outline against the reflected wall. I spent that night in my car, parked 3 blocks away, doors locked, radio playing white noise until dawn. I called the landlord the next morning, tried to explain what I'd seen without sounding insane. There was a long pause after I finished, the kind that meant he thought I was crazy or high or both. The previous tenant, I pressed. Why did they leave? Another pause. Then, they broke their lease early, paid the penalty without complaint, didn't give a reason. And before that? Look, his voice tightened. If you want to break your lease too, we can discuss options, but I'm not going to sit here and... I hung up. The apartment waited for me like a mouth. I stood outside for 20 minutes before I could make myself unlock the door. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The mirror reflected the mundane reality of my living room with perfect accuracy. Morning sunlight made everything look safe, normal, explainable. I decided I was losing my mind. Stress, isolation, too many late nights staring at screens. The brain does strange things when pushed, creates patterns where none exist, sees movement in stillness, manufactures fears from nothing. I'd read about this. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. I just needed rest, proper sleep, maybe some vitamin D. The rationalizations lasted until nightfall. I tried moving the mirror, tried to drag it away from the wall, turn it around, push it into another room. Anything to break whatever connection I'd imagined. But the thing was impossibly heavy, as if it had been nailed to the floor. I pulled until my muscles screamed, and sweat soaked through my shirt, and it didn't budge even a centimeter. When I stopped breathing hard, I noticed something in the reflection. Condensation. On the mirror's surface, in a pattern that looked almost like breath marks. like someone had been standing close, exhaling against the glass. But I was across the room. That's when I started examining the wall, really examining it, running my hands over every inch of plaster, looking for seams, for weak points, for any indication of what might be on the other side. The surface was rough in places, smooth in others, painted over so many times the original texture was lost. Near the baseboard, my fingers found a soft spot, slightly warmer than the surrounding wall. I pressed harder. The plaster gave slightly, like a bruise. I pulled my hand back and stepped away, a cold recognition settling in my stomach. The wall was thin here, thinner than it should be. And on the other side, what? I spent the rest of the night sitting in the kitchen with all the lights on, drinking coffee that tasted like fear, waiting for sunrise. The scratching started on the 4th week, soft at first, like fingernails dragging across plaster. It came from inside the wall, from the space between my room and whatever lay beyond. I put my ear against the surface and heard it clearly. A steady, rhythmic scraping, moving up and down, following some pattern I couldn't decipher. Then it stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard something else. Breathing. Deep, slow breaths, in perfect sync with my own. I held my breath and the sound continued for exactly 2 more seconds before it also stopped. I stepped back from the wall and looked at the mirror. My reflection looked back, pale and hollow-eyed. Behind my reflected self, the reflected wall was blank and normal. But I knew with a certainty that bypassed logic, that someone was standing there, on the other side, listening, matching my breathing, waiting. That night, I decided to move the mirror properly. Not push it aside, but pull it completely away from the wall, even if I had to break the thing. I needed to see what was behind it, needed to understand what was happening before my mind finished unraveling. I braced myself and pulled with everything I had. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the mirror shifted. Just an inch. But it was enough. I pulled again, harder, and suddenly it was moving, sliding across the floor with surprising ease, as if whatever had held it in place had simply let go. The wall behind it was covered in marks, handprints, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, overlapping and smudged and pressed into the plaster with enough force to leave indentations. Every single one was oriented the same way, fingers pointing toward my side of the wall, palms pressed flat, as if someone on the other side had been pushing, trying to break through. I stood there, staring at those desperate clutching hands frozen in plaster, and something inside me went very quiet. The marks were old. The plaster had dried around them long ago. Whoever had made them had done so before I'd moved in, maybe long before. But as I stared, I realized something that made my vision narrow to a pinpoint. The marks were wet. Fresh moisture glistened on the palms, darkening the plaster. As I watched, one of the handprints seemed to press deeper, the indentation growing, fingers curling slightly, and I heard that soft, tearing sound again. I looked at the mirror, now sitting at an angle in the middle of my living room. Its surface no longer reflected my room accurately. Instead, it showed a space almost identical to mine, but subtly wrong. The furniture was the same, but older, more worn. The walls were a different shade, and standing in that reflected room, visible now without the wall to hide behind it, was a figure. Tall, thin, perfectly still, watching me through the glass. I could see my reflection too, superimposed over that other room, creating a double exposure that hurt to look at. My transparent face stared back at me while behind it, through it, that figure stood motionless in its own space, in its own version of this room. And then it moved its hand, slowly, deliberately, and pressed it against its side of the mirror. On the wall, in the same position, a new handprint appeared. The plaster bulged outward, fingers pressing through from the other side, reaching toward me. I understood then. Not the how or the why, but the what. The wall wasn't a wall anymore. The mirror had shown me that. It was a membrane, growing thinner, the barrier between here and there, between this room and that room, between me and whatever existed in that parallel space. And something had been trying to break through for a very long time. I haven't left the apartment in 3 days. I should. I know I should. But every time I move toward the door, I see it in the corner of my eye, that figure in the mirror, tracking my movement. And I wonder, if I leave, what happens to this room? This space that's being invaded by that other space. What happens when the wall finally breaks? The handprints multiply daily now. They appear in the morning, fresh and wet, clustered around the spot where the mirror used to stand. I've tried covering them with paint, with newspaper, with anything, but they bleed through within hours. The plaster is soft everywhere now, yielding under my touch like skin. Last night I heard my neighbor for the first time. Not sounds of movement, not scratching or breathing. My own voice, muffled and distant, coming from the other side of the wall. Speaking words I'd said hours earlier, played back in perfect detail, a recording of my life filtering through from that other room. I pressed my ear against the wall, and I heard myself making coffee, typing on my keyboard, clearing my throat. An echo of my existence, slightly delayed, slightly distorted. And then I heard a second voice, also mine, but wrong somehow. Different. It was asking questions, asking where the mirror was, asking why the wall felt strange, asking if anyone else was there. I pulled away and looked at the mirror. Both figures stared back at me now. Me, and that other thing that looked like me, standing in its version of my room, its hand pressed against its side of the glass. And slowly, very slowly, I'm beginning to understand. I don't know which side of the wall I'm really on anymore. I don't know if I'm the one trying to break through or the one trying to keep something out. The mirror shows me both possibilities, both rooms, both versions existing simultaneously, and I can't tell which reflection is real. Sometimes I catch myself touching the wall without remembering walking over to it. Sometimes I find handprints on my skin that match the ones on the plaster. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, my reflection moves just slightly out of sync, its eyes following something I can't see. The wall is breathing now. I can feel it. In and out. In and out. Like lungs expanding and contracting. The handprints pulse with the rhythm. Tonight I'm going to press my palm against one of them. Match my hand to those desperate, clutching fingers. See what happens when both sides touch in the same place at the same time. Maybe I'll break through. Maybe something will break through to me. Maybe we're both trying to get out. Maybe we're both already trapped. The mirror knows. It's been showing me all along. 2 rooms, 2 walls, 2 versions of the same person, each one convinced the other is the invader, each one pressing harder and harder against the barrier, trying to reach through. I can hear my voice on the other side right now, whispering the same things I'm thinking, and I wonder, when the wall finally breaks, which one of us will be left? Or will we both disappear into that space between, that impossible gap where the mirror lives, that place that's neither here nor there but somehow both? The handprints are glowing now, luminescent in the darkness, calling, beckoning. I'm walking toward the wall. My reflection is walking toward me. We're going to meet in the middle. We're going to find out what's on the other side of real. Story 10. The house settled around me on my first night like an old man easing into a chair, all creaks and whispers and the particular silence that comes from walls that have stood for nearly a century. I'd signed the lease that afternoon, my signature still fresh on documents that smelled faintly of mildew, and the inspector's words echoed in my mind as I arranged boxes in what would become my living room. The original blueprints show a basement, but there's no access point. Probably sealed off decades ago. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. I should have paid more attention to how he paused before saying that, the way his eyes had lingered on the floorboards. The sound started on the 3rd night. I'd been settling into a routine, unpacking by day, exhausted enough by evening to sleep despite the house's peculiar acoustics. The way sound seemed to pool in certain corners, the odd echo when I spoke aloud. That night, I woke to a dragging sound, rhythmic and deliberate, like furniture being pushed across a wooden floor. But the sound came from below me, from a space that supposedly didn't exist. I lay rigid in bed, counting the seconds between each scrape. 20 seconds of silence, then the drag. 15 seconds. Another scrape, closer this time, or at least it felt closer. My rational mind supplied explanations. Pipes settling, the house's foundation shifting, sounds traveling strangely through old walls. But my body knew better. Every muscle tensed as I listened to something moving beneath me, tracing what might have been a path across a forgotten room. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. Houses made sounds. Old houses made old sounds. The coffee I made tasted wrong, metallic and bitter, but I drank it anyway, standing at the kitchen window and watching my neighbors go about their morning routines. Normal people in a normal neighborhood. Nothing to worry about. The inspector had left his number, so I called him that afternoon. He sounded distracted when he answered, traffic noise in the background, and I felt foolish even as I asked about the basement, about whether sealed spaces could create acoustic anomalies. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that made the coffee turn to ice in my stomach. Did you find the gap in the floorboards yet? I hadn't mentioned any gap. I hadn't found any gap. But his question hung in the air between us like smoke. And when I asked him what he meant, the line went dead. I tried calling back 3 times. It went straight to voicemail. That evening, I got down on my hands and knees in the living room and searched. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting the hardwood in bands of gold and shadow, and I ran my fingers along each seam between boards, pressing and probing. It took nearly an hour to find it, hidden in the corner where an old armchair sat, a gap between 2 boards, barely wide enough to slide a piece of paper through. The wood around it was darker than the rest of the floor, as if something had stained it over many years. I knelt there, staring at that thin black line, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. The rational part of my brain insisted this was nothing, just a natural gap in old flooring. But something deeper, something primitive, screamed at me to move away. I didn't. Instead, I leaned closer, bringing my ear near the gap, and I listened. At first, nothing. Just the ambient sound of the house, the distant hum of traffic, my own breathing. Then, so faint I almost missed it, a whisper of movement. Not mechanical, not the house settling. This was different, purposeful, careful, like someone down there was also listening, waiting to hear if I would make a sound. I jerked back so fast I knocked over a stack of books. The crash seemed impossibly loud in the stillness, and for a frozen moment, I waited for some response from below. None came. Just silence, thick and expectant. That night, I pushed the armchair over the gap. Then I dragged my coffee table on top of the armchair. Then I piled boxes on top of the coffee table. The tower I built looked absurd, unstable, but I needed that gap covered. I needed to know that nothing could slide through it. The dragging sounds came again around 2 in the morning, and this time they seemed agitated, moving faster, covering more ground. I pulled my blankets over my head like a frightened boy and waited for dawn. The note appeared on the 5th night. I'd been researching the house's history during my lunch breaks at work, digging through county records and old newspaper archives, finding nothing but the usual procession of owners and sales. The house was built in 1927, changed hands every decade or so, unremarkable in every way except for the missing basement. When I came home that evening, my tower of furniture had been moved. Not scattered or knocked over, carefully dismantled and arranged in a neat pile against the wall. The gap in the floorboards lay exposed, and through that gap, just visible in the dying light, was a corner of white paper. My hand shook as I pulled it free. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting on it was immediately impossibly familiar. It was mine, my loops and slants, my particular way of crossing T's, the slight backward slant I'd had since elementary school. But the words were foreign, written in my hand but not by me. Don't come down here again. He still remembers you. I read it 5 times, 10 times, looking for some indication that it was a prank, a forgery, anything other than what it appeared to be. but I knew my own handwriting the way I knew my own face. And this was it. This was mine. The paper itself felt wrong in my fingers, too cold, too heavy, as if it had been somewhere very dark for a very long time. Don't come down here again. Again implied a first time. Implied I'd been down there before, in a basement I'd never seen, had never known existed until the inspector mentioned it. I turned the note over. On the back, in the same handwriting, a single word. Please. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie in bed listening to the sounds below, trying to map them, trying to understand the geography of a space I couldn't access. Sometimes the dragging came from what I calculated would be beneath the living room. Other times it seemed to originate from under the kitchen or the hallway, or directly beneath my bedroom. The movements traced patterns I couldn't decipher, circuits that made no sense, unless whatever was down there was moving in ways that defied the house's dimensions. On the 7th night, I found another note. This time it had been placed on my kitchen counter, centered precisely between the salt and pepper shakers. I'd been home all evening. I'd heard nothing, seen no one. But there it was, written in my handwriting. He's getting closer to the stairs. What stairs? There were no stairs. There was no access to the basement. That's what the inspector had said, what the blueprints showed, no access. But the note knew about stairs. I began to notice other things. My coffee mug would be on the wrong side of the sink when I came downstairs in the morning. Books I'd left closed would be open to specific pages, though I couldn't find any pattern to what they marked. Once, I found all the furniture in my bedroom rotated exactly 90 degrees, every piece turned with geometric precision. I'd slept through it. I'd been in the room, unconscious, while someone or something had moved my bed, my dresser, my nightstand, all without waking me. The dream started then, though calling them dreams doesn't capture their visceral clarity. I'd find myself standing in a dim basement, concrete walls weeping moisture, a single bulb swinging overhead. The space felt infinite and cramped simultaneously, stretching away into shadows while pressing close against my skin. And there was always a door in these dreams. A door I knew I'd opened once, though I couldn't remember when or why. Behind that door, something waited, something that knew my name, that wore my handwriting like a costume, that had been waiting far longer than I'd been alive. In the dreams, I could hear myself speaking, but the words came out backwards, reversed, as if time itself was running in the wrong direction down there. And always, just before I woke, I'd see the stairs. Wooden stairs, worn smooth in the center from countless feet, leading up to a door that opened into my living room. A door that didn't exist. That had never existed. But the stairs remembered me. I called the landlord on the 8th day, told him I needed to break the lease, made up an excuse about a family emergency. He was sympathetic, almost too sympathetic, and when I mentioned wanting to look at the basement before I left, he became very quiet. Then he said something that stopped my breath. There's nothing down there for you anymore. Leave it alone. Anymore. He'd said anymore. As if there had been something down there once. For me specifically. That night I lay awake, listening to the dragging sounds, and I realized they'd changed. No longer random or searching. They'd become rhythmic, purposeful. They were moving to the beat of my heart. When I held my breath, they paused. When my pulse quickened with fear, they accelerated. Whatever was below me was synchronizing itself to my body, learning my rhythms, matching my patterns. The third note appeared around midnight. I watched it slide through the gap in the floorboards, emerging slowly like something being born. This time I was ready, rushing over to grab it while it was still half emerged, hoping to feel resistance, to confirm that someone was down there pushing it up. But the paper came free easily, weightlessly, as if it had pushed itself through the gap. The handwriting was deteriorating, still mine, but shaky now, letters running into each other with an urgency that bordered on panic. He found the way up. The door opens from both sides. I tried to warn you. I tried to warn myself. It's too late now. He knows we're the same person. I read that last line until the words lost meaning. He knows we're the same person. Not knows about me. Knows we're the same. My handwriting, my warnings. My fear, transcribed in letters I'd never written but recognized completely. The scratching started at the edges of my consciousness around 3 a.m, not the dragging sounds, which had become so familiar I barely noticed them anymore, but something new. Something at the periphery of my awareness, like fingers tracing the inside of my skull. When I closed my eyes, I could see the basement. Not imagine it, not dream it. See it, as if through my own eyes, standing in that concrete tomb with the swinging bulb and the impossible door. And I could see what was down there with me. It stood in the corner where shadows pooled deepest, and it wore my shape the way I wore my skin. Not quite right, not quite wrong. When it moved, I felt the echo in my own muscles. When it breathed, my lungs expanded. And when it looked up at the ceiling, at the floorboards, at the gap, at me lying in bed directly above, I felt my own eyes moving in their sockets, tracking myself from below. The inspector called me back on the 9th morning. I'd given up on hearing from him, had almost forgotten I'd tried to reach him at all, but his voice on the other end of the line brought everything rushing back. He sounded older than I remembered, tired, and he didn't apologize for not returning my calls. Instead, he asked me a question. Have you figured it out yet? I wanted to hang up. I wanted to demand explanations, accuse him of being part of whatever was happening. But my voice came out small and afraid. Figured what out? Why you rented that specific house? Why out of all the places you looked at, you chose that one? I told myself it was the price, the location, the quiet street. But even as I formed the words, I knew they were lies. I'd known as soon as I walked through the door on that first viewing. I'd felt it in my bones, in some locked room of my memory. I'd been here before. Not in this life, not in any way I could articulate. But the house had recognized me, and I had recognized it. You used to live there, the inspector said, and his voice carried the weight of a confession. 40 years ago. You and your family rented it for 2 years. You were 6 years old when you moved out. 40 years ago, I would have been negative 34 years old. I wasn't born until decades later. The math didn't work, couldn't work, but something in my chest constricted with recognition anyway. A feeling like coming home and finding all the furniture rearranged. Check your left forearm, he said. About 3 inches below your elbow. You'll find a scar there. You got it when you were 7, the last week you lived in that house. Fell through a gap in the floorboards and cut yourself on something sharp down there. Your mother sealed the basement after that. No door, no stairs, no access. But you'd already been down there by then. You'd already seen what was waiting. I hung up. The phone slipped from my shaking fingers. And slowly, dreading what I'd find, I looked at my left forearm. The scar was there, thin and white and old, exactly 3 inches below my elbow. A scar I'd carried my entire life and never questioned, never wondered about. And underneath it, beneath the skin, I could feel something moving. Not blood, not muscle, something else. Something that had been waiting down there for 40 years, or 40 hours, or no time at all, because time worked differently in sealed spaces, in forgotten basements, in the gaps between what happened and what we remember happening. The final note appeared that afternoon while I sat on my couch, staring at nothing. I watched it slide through the gap, my note to myself, the handwriting now barely legible, dissolving into frantic scrawls. I'm writing this from upstairs. You're reading this from upstairs. We're both upstairs now, aren't we? But I can still hear the dragging sounds below. I can still feel him down there, wearing my shape, learning my patterns. He's been practicing, 40 years of practice. He's almost perfect now. Soon you won't be able to tell us apart. Soon I won't be able to tell us apart. Are you reading this? Am I reading this? When did I start writing it? When will I finish? The letters ran together at the end, words overlapping words. My handwriting layered on top of itself until the paper was black with ink. And beneath it all, pressed so hard the pen had torn through the paper, checked the gap. I got down on my hands and knees, my heart a drum in my ears. and I looked through the gap in the floorboards. Down there, in the darkness of a basement that didn't exist, a single light bulb swung on a cord. In its swaying illumination, I could see concrete walls, moisture dark. And in the center of that impossible room, looking up at me through the gap, I saw my own face staring back. It smiled with my smile, blinked with my eyes, and slowly, deliberately, it placed a finger to its lips. Shh. Behind it, barely visible in the swinging light, I could see the stairs. They led up to a door that opened into my living room, a door I'd been standing next to all along without seeing it, because some doors only appear when you're ready to remember they've always been there. I heard the knob turn. I heard the hinges creak. I heard footsteps on stairs that didn't exist, climbing toward a room where I knelt frozen, staring at my own face in the darkness below. And as the door swung open behind me, as I felt the cold air from the basement breathing across the back of my neck, I finally understood the inspector's question. Why had I rented this house? Why had I come back? Because I'd never left. I'm writing this now, in my own handwriting, sliding it through the gap in the floorboards. Someone down there needs to read it. Someone who will move into this house in a few days or a few decades or no time at all. Someone who will hear the dragging sounds and find the notes and recognize the handwriting as their own. Don't come down here again, I want to tell them. But I know they will. I know I will. I'm already on my way. Story 11. The building settles differently at 3 in the morning. Not the usual creaks of cooling metal or the hum of ancient ventilation, but something deeper, more deliberate, like the architecture itself is exhaling. I've worked night security at the Meridian Tower for 2 years now, and I know every sound this place makes, or at least I thought I did. The 23rd floor has been vacant since before I started. Budget cuts, someone told me once. Asbestos remediation, said another. The reasons changed depending on who you asked, but the result was always the same. Locked doors, dark windows, and a sensor system that pinged movement almost nightly. Management called it electrical interference, said the wiring up there was compromised, needed replacing, would get to it eventually. Eventually never came. I stopped checking the alerts after the first month. False positives, all of them, until they weren't. It started with the lights. I'd be making my rounds on the lower floors when I'd catch it in my peripheral vision through the stairwell windows. Fluorescent glow bleeding from the 23rd floor corridor, visible through the frosted glass of the fire doors. By the time I climbed the stairs, everything would be dark again. Motion sensors, I told myself. Faulty timers. But motion sensors need motion, and there was never anyone up there. The night I decided to install the camera, I'd been sitting in the ground floor security booth watching the monitor cycle through its automated feeds. Empty lobby, empty parking garage, empty corridors on floors 3 through 22. Then the 23rd floor sensor went red again, the third time that shift, and something inside me just snapped. Not anger exactly, more like a need to prove something to myself, to the building, to the indifferent silence that pressed against the windows. I found an old security camera in the storage closet, one of the analog models they'd replaced 5 years back but never thrown out. The thing was heavy, institutional, the kind that would actually record to a hard drive instead of the cloud. I wanted something I could review myself, without involving management or their explanations that always felt just slightly off-center from the truth. The 23rd floor smelled wrong. That was the first thing I noticed when I pushed through the fire door, camera case in one hand, flashlight in the other. Not the mustiness of disuse or the chemical tang of old carpets. Something underneath those, organic and cold, like the air in a place that had been sealed too long. The motion sensor lights flickered on as I entered, and for a moment I stood there in the humming fluorescence, looking down a corridor that stretched 60 feet before T intersecting with another. The layout matched the occupied floors below, but emptiness transformed it into something alien. Doors hung ajar on dark offices where desks and chairs sat arranged as if their occupants had simply stepped out for lunch and never returned. Water coolers stood sentinel in corners. A coat rack near the elevator still held 3 jackets. their shoulders thick with dust. I mounted the camera in the main corridor, angling it to capture the longest sight line. The feed looked clean when I tested it on my phone. Just a hallway, motionless and waiting. I told myself I'd review it in the morning, after my shift ended, when daylight could buffer whatever I might find. But morning felt impossibly far away as I descended the stairs. And I couldn't stop thinking about those jackets, hanging like shed skins. At 4:47 a.m., I queued up the footage. The timestamp ran in the corner. 1:23 a.m., about 2 hours after I'd installed the camera. Nothing happened for several minutes. The corridor sat in perfect stillness, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own pulse. Then the lights at the far end of the hall brightened slightly, as if something had triggered the next sensor over, just out of frame. He walked into view at 1:31 a.m. A man in a dark suit, moving with the measured pace of someone deep in thought. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his head was slightly bowed, like he was studying something on the floor. But I could only see him from the rib cage up. His legs, his feet, the lower half of his torso, they just weren't there. Not cut off or obscured, simply absent, as if he were walking on a floor that existed 8 or 9 inches higher than the one the camera was recording. He reached the T intersection and turned left, his torso gliding smoothly out of frame. The lights dimmed back to their standard level. The corridor returned to stillness. I watched the footage 3 more times, my hand trembling slightly on the mouse. There had to be an explanation. Camera angle, perspective distortion, some trick of the lens. But the man's movement had been too fluid, too natural. He wasn't floating or hovering. He was walking, clearly and deliberately, on a surface I couldn't see. I didn't go back to the 23rd floor that night. I finished my shift in the lobby, watching the monitor cycle through its feeds, and when my replacement arrived at 6, I told him the system was acting up, but nothing serious. My voice sounded normal, professional, like I was still the person I'd been 8 hours ago. At home, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing him in my mind, that partial figure pacing in the empty corridor, and I kept trying to logic my way around what I'd witnessed. Old buildings settle, floors compress. Maybe the 23rd floor used to be higher, had been releveled at some point, and somehow this was, what, an echo? A recording in the air itself? The rationalization felt thin even as I constructed it, but I clung to it anyway. The next night, I brought a tape measure. The 23rd floor corridor looked exactly as I'd left it, empty, undisturbed, waiting. I measured from the current floor to the ceiling, 12 feet, standard for this era of construction. I measured the same dimension on the 22nd floor directly below, 12 feet. No discrepancy, no lost inches, no evidence of compression or adjustment. But when I checked the camera footage from that second night, he was there again. Same suit, same posture, same impossible elevation. This time he paused in the middle of the corridor, right in the camera's center frame, and appeared to look at something on the wall. His hand reached out, fingers touching air at a height where nothing existed, and then he turned and walked back the way he'd come, disappearing beyond the camera's view. I started hearing the footsteps on the third night. I was on the 22nd floor, doing my routine walkthrough, when I heard them directly above me. Measured, steady footfalls on a surface that shouldn't exist. They moved from one end of the building to the other, tracking across the ceiling of the corridor where I stood frozen, flashlight raised like it might somehow illuminate what I was hearing. The steps stopped. Silence crashed back in, so total and complete that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Then, directly overhead, a sound like palms pressing flat against a surface. Sliding. Searching. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran, taking the stairs 2 at a time down to the lobby, where light and the familiar hum of electronics felt like a border I could crouch behind. I filed an incident report, vague and professional. Unusual sounds on upper floor, possible structural issue, recommend inspection. I knew no one would read it carefully. No one ever did. But I couldn't stop going back. Something was pulling me there, night after night. I'd tell myself I was being thorough, professional, just checking the feed. But the truth was darker and more urgent. I needed to see him again. Needed to understand what he was, what he wanted, why he walked that higher floor that only he could feel beneath his feet. The footage accumulated. Sometimes he appeared multiple times in a single night, following the same route, pausing at the same invisible landmarks. Other times, the corridor remained empty for hours, and I'd feel something like disappointment settling in my chest. On the sixth night, I watched him stop in the exact center of the frame and look directly at the camera. Not at it, but through it, as if seeing something on the other side. His expression was neutral, businesslike. He raised one hand in a gesture that might have been a wave, or might have been a warning, and then he was gone. The footsteps became a nightly occurrence. I'd hear them on whatever floor I was on, always directly above me, tracking my position with uncomfortable precision. They'd follow me down corridors, pause when I paused, resume when I moved. The sound was too clear, too distinct to be pipes or settling. These were footfalls, shoe leather on linoleum or tile, a surface I couldn't see but that he walked as naturally as I walked mine. I started documenting everything: timestamps, duration of appearances, the exact route he walked. Patterns emerged. He always entered from the eastern end of the corridor. He always paused at 3 specific points, touching the wall at that higher level as if checking something, reading something. He always exited heading west. And he was always alone, this man in his dark suit, pacing his elevated floor. In the second week, I noticed the cold. The 23rd floor had always been climate controlled, same as the rest of the building, but now when I entered, the temperature dropped noticeably. Not frigid, but wrong, like the cold that rises off a lake in winter. It sank into my clothes, my skin, made my joints ache in ways that felt older than my 36 years. I started wearing a jacket on my rounds, even though the building regulations specifically prohibited it. The cold followed me. I'd be on the 15th floor, warm and normal, and then feel that familiar drop in temperature. Seconds later, the footsteps would start above me, and I'd know he was there, walking his invisible architecture. My supervisor noticed I'd lost weight, asked if everything was okay at home, if I needed some personal time. I assured him I was fine, just fighting off a bug. Nothing serious. But I could see the concern in his eyes, the way he looked at me like I was something fragile that might break with the wrong word. Maybe I was. The footage from night 12 showed something new. The man stopped in his usual spot at the center of the corridor, but this time he crouched down, his torso lowering until his shoulders were level with what I knew to be the actual floor. He reached toward the ground, his hand moving with the careful precision of someone picking up an object. When he stood, he was holding something invisible, turning it over, examining it. Then he placed it into his jacket pocket and resumed walking. I went up there immediately, abandoning the pretense of reviewing footage after my shift. The corridor was dark until the motion sensors caught me, then lit in that fluorescent wash that never felt quite bright enough. I walked to the spot where I'd seen him crouch, where my floor and his floor intersected in whatever impossible geometry governed this place. There was nothing there, just industrial carpet, worn and colorless. But when I knelt and pressed my palms flat, I felt it. Warmth, faint but unmistakable, in a shape roughly the size of my hand, like someone had been touching this exact spot moments before I arrived. The warmth faded as I watched, bleeding away into the surrounding cold until I couldn't distinguish it from the ambient temperature. I stood there for a long time, looking at that patch of carpet, trying to understand what I was being shown. That night, for the first time, I heard him speak. I was on the 19th floor, making notes in my incident log about a burned-out exit sign, when the footsteps started above me. Normal now, expected. I didn't even look up. But then I heard it. A voice, muffled but distinct, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. Not loud, conversational, like someone talking on a phone or dictating notes to themselves. The voice moved with the footsteps, tracking across the ceiling, and I followed it down the corridor, my own feet keeping pace below. The words remained indistinct, but the tone was clear. Frustration, maybe urgency, the voice of someone trying to solve a problem they didn't quite understand. I knew that feeling intimately. On the 23rd floor camera, later that same night, I watched him make a call. His hand moved to his ear in the universal gesture of holding a phone, though I could see no device. His mouth moved, forming words I'd never hear, his free hand gesturing in emphasis. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. When it ended, he stood very still for a moment, his head tilted as if listening to something beyond the camera's range. And then he walked out of frame heading west, like always. I started researching the building's history. Old newspapers, planning commission documents, whatever I could access from public databases and historical societies. The Meridian Tower had been completed in 1968, 23 floors of modern commercial space. Nothing unusual in the construction reports. No accidents, no deaths on site. The building had been continuously occupied until 2019, when the top floor was vacated for reasons the records described vaguely as restructuring. But I found a footnote in a planning document from 1967, a year before completion. The original design had called for 24 floors. During construction, the specifications were changed, reducing the height by 1 full story. The revised plans were approved without explanation, and the building was completed to the new specification, 23 floors, not 24. I looked at the blueprints until my eyes burned. The 23rd floor ceiling was exactly where it should be, 12 feet from the floor. There was no missing story, no phantom level. But the man walked 8 inches higher, as if he knew a truth the architecture was denying. I measured again, obsessively, checking and rechecking. Floor to ceiling, 12 feet, always 12 feet. But the camera never lied. He walked higher, touched higher, existed in a space that shouldn't be there. On night 17, I spoke to him. I stood in the corridor, directly under where I knew he walked, and I said his name. Except I didn't know his name, so I just said, "Hey." My voice sounded small and uncertain in that empty space. "I can see you, on the camera. I can hear you walking. I don't understand what's happening, but I need to know what you want." Silence. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Nothing responded. But that night, on the footage, he stopped. Right in the middle of his walk, he stopped and turned, looking directly at where I'd been standing hours earlier. His expression was impossible to read at that resolution, but his body language was clear. Attention, focus. He saw something. Maybe he saw me somehow, through whatever membrane separated his world from mine. He raised his hand again, that same gesture, and then he was gone. The footsteps became constant, every night, every floor, tracking me with methodical persistence. I started to wonder if I was the one being watched, if all this time I'd been documenting him while he documented me. 2 people in adjacent impossibilities, observing each other across a gap neither of us could cross. I stopped sleeping properly. The distinction between night shift and day, between waking and dreaming, began to blur. I'd be home in bed and feel the building around me, sense its empty corridors and dark offices. I'd hear the footsteps sometimes, faint through my apartment walls, and I couldn't tell if they were real, or if I'd brought him home with me somehow, imported him into my life like a virus. My supervisor put me on mandatory leave after I was found on the 23rd floor at dawn, measuring the walls with a laser level, muttering about discrepancies that didn't exist. I didn't fight it. I knew how I looked. Obsessed, unraveling, the textbook case of isolation psychosis. But I went back. The night before my leave started, I went back one final time. The corridor was dark when I arrived, the motion sensors slow to respond, and for a moment I stood in the near total blackness, feeling the cold sink into me. When the lights finally flickered on, I walked to the exact center of the hallway, the spot where he always paused, and I looked up. The ceiling was 12 feet above me, solid, unbroken. No hidden space, no missing floor, just ceiling tiles and fluorescent fixtures, ordinary and unambiguous. But I knew he was there. I could feel him, sense his presence like a pressure against my skin. He was walking his higher floor, just out of phase with mine, separated by inches that might as well have been light years. I placed my hand flat against the wall where he always touched. The surface was cold, smooth, unremarkable, but as I stood there, palm pressed flat, I felt it again. Warmth, building slowly beneath my fingers, as if someone on the other side was matching my gesture, touching back. We stood like that, or I imagined we did, for what felt like hours. Two people pressing against opposite sides of the same wall, each trying to prove to the other that they were real, that this impossible connection meant something. When I finally pulled my hand away, the warmth remained for a few seconds, then faded. I never went back to the Meridian Tower. My leave became a resignation, processed efficiently by HR with the barest minimum of questions. They found someone else to work nights, someone who wouldn't obsess over faulty sensors and empty floors. But sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I hear them. Footsteps, measured and steady, pacing above me where there's no floor, no space, no possible explanation. And I wonder if he's still there, walking his elevated corridor, touching walls I can't see, living in a geometry that refuses to align with mine. Or I wonder if I'm still there, if I never really left, if some part of me is still standing in that corridor, with my hand pressed against the wall, waiting for the warmth of contact from a place I can only see through a camera lens. The worst part isn't the uncertainty. It's the knowledge that there's no answer I could find that would be better than this. The not knowing, the question that has no resolution. Because if he's real, then the world is more impossible than I can accept. And if he's not real, if this is all some fracture in my own perception, then I've lost something fundamental about myself, some anchor to consensus reality. Either way, I'm no longer sure which floor I'm walking on, mine or his, or if there's any difference left between them. Story 12. The first time I noticed it, I convinced myself it was coincidence. 7 o'clock, like always. The graveyard shift ending at the industrial fabrication plant where I'd worked quality control for the past 3 years. The parking lot stretched out like an asphalt ocean under sodium lights that buzzed and flickered, casting everything in sickly amber. Most of the district shut down after 5, leaving the area feeling like the edge of the world. Empty warehouses with darkened windows, chain-link fences topped with rusted barbed wire, streets where you could stand for an hour without seeing another car pass. I was the last one out most nights. The foreman left at 6:30, and the cleaning crew finished by 6:45. That left me alone to lock up, set the alarms, and walk across 200 feet of cracked pavement to where I always parked my car. A silver sedan, nothing special, 6 years old with a dent in the rear bumper from where I'd backed into a post 2 winters ago. Except that night, there were 2 cars. The second one sat maybe 30 feet behind mine, angled slightly toward the building. Same make, same model, same silver paint that looked gray under the sodium lights. Even from a distance, I could see the dent in its rear bumper, positioned exactly where mine was. I stopped walking. The keys felt suddenly heavy in my hand, the metal cold against my palm despite the mild spring evening. A breeze pushed a plastic bag across the lot, scraping it against the pavement with a sound like fingernails on concrete. The logical part of my brain, the part trained to spot defects in machine parts, to notice when measurements were off by fractions of millimeters, started cataloging explanations. Popular model, common color. The dent was coincidence, or maybe I was seeing it wrong in this light. Someone from the day shift had car trouble and left it overnight. But the car wasn't there when I'd arrived for my shift at 11 the previous night. I would have noticed. I always notice. I approached my car slowly, my footsteps echoing off the empty buildings around us. The other vehicle remained completely still, its windows dark. Not just tinted, but dark in a way that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I couldn't see through them at all, couldn't make out even the suggestion of an interior. When I got close enough to see my license plate clearly, my stomach dropped. I turned to look at the other car, squinting against the glare of the security lights. From this angle, I could just make out its plate. The numbers and letters matched mine exactly. My hand shook as I unlocked my car door. The sound of the lock disengaging seemed obscenely loud. I kept my eyes on the other vehicle as I climbed in, half expecting it to start moving, to approach, to do something. But it just sat there, inert and watchful. I started my engine. The duplicate remained silent. As I drove past it toward the exit, I tried to look through the windows, but the darkness inside was absolute. Yet I felt it, a certainty that crawled up my spine and nested at the base of my skull, that someone inside was watching me, not just looking, watching, the way you watch something you're studying, learning, preparing to become. The second night, I told myself I wouldn't look. I'd lock up, walk to my car, and drive home without letting my eyes drift toward that spot where the duplicate had been. It wouldn't be there anyway, obviously,